Today we will be touring the library of learning expert and Wall Street Journal bestselling author Scott H. Young. His book, Ultralearning, The Essential Guide to Mastering Hard Skills and Future-Proofing Your Career, has sold over 200,000 copies and is my go-to recommendation for people looking for a science-backed framework for self-directed learning. Scott is also well known for his MIT Challenge project, where he independently completed the core coursework of MIT's 4-year computer science curriculum in just 12 months using MIT's free open courseware materials. Now, for the first time ever, Scott is sharing his library, including the key resources he used to write his books on self-directed learning. Also, for the first time ever on the channel, we're touring not just his physical library, but also his Kindle and Audible collections, which you can find at the end of the video via the timestamps in the description. As some of you longtime subscribers know, I've interviewed Scott twice before on this channel, as we share a common interest in self-directed lifelong learning and personal development. We ended up going book by book through his entire collection, discussing key authors, theories, and frameworks along the way. We talked about AI, learning transfer, mental models and abstract thinking, analogies, education debates, memory and cognitive psychology, expertise and deliberate practice, scientific eminence, skill acquisition, genius, creativity, flow, daily habits, deep work, foreign language learning, intellectual history, philosophy, and Scott's Foundations program. Before we jump in, just a quick note that there's some bonus resources that go along with this bookshelf tour in the first link in the description. The first bonus is a shared folder where you can download all of the high-resolution photos of Scott's library. You'll also get a resources spreadsheet, which will give you links to where you can find some of the key books and other resources we talked about in this video. You'll also get my classics resources spreadsheet, which collects in one place all the key details for the major facing page translation book sets, like the Loeb Classical Library and other similar sets from Harvard University Press, as well as other publishers of facing page translation libraries. You'll also get a free book where I've gathered all the best advice about how to manage your library and how to improve your reading from the 55 plus hours of bookshelf tours I've conducted over the past couple of years. Just click the first link in the description to get all of these free bonuses. Also, if you'd like to do a bookshelf tour with me, please email timothy@timothykenny.com. Lastly, a big thank you to all of my students for your continued support that makes these long-form bookshelf tours possible. There are 2 courses that I teach that may interest you and are most relevant to the subjects we cover in this tour. The first course is my Self-Directed Learner course, which will help you build all the skills required to pursue lifelong education through all the key steps like learning project organization, skill investing, research, reading and annotating, note-taking, memorizing, and putting your learning into action directly or through a program of deliberate practice. Please click the second link in the description for more on the Self-Directed Learner course. The second course is the Mental Models course, which will teach you how to build a lattice work of mental models so you can increase the clarity of your thinking and the quality of your learning and decision-making. Model-based thinking allows you to turn complex information and vague lessons into discrete mental models that you can cleanly apply across a wide variety of situations. You'll learn what models are, how they work, how they connect to each other, and how to create new models to maximize your decision-making abilities and generate novel insights. Click the third link in the description to learn more about this best-selling course and to get on the wait list for information about my forthcoming Advanced Mental Models course to be announced later this year. If you'd like to learn more about my other courses, programs, and learning tracks and how you can support the production of these bookshelf tours, please click the fourth link in the description where you can view my complete course catalog. And now let's get into the bookshelf tour with Scott H. Young. All right, so Scott, thanks a lot for sharing your bookshelves with us. And I thought we'd start with just maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and then how you've put this library together over the years and how you've organized it.
Sure. So my name is Scott. I've been a blogger online writing essays for about 20 years. I've written 2 books published with traditional publishers, Ultralearning and Get Better at Anything. And yeah, I write about learning and reading and education and productivity and all sorts of good stuff like that. And yeah, I was saying to Tim before that this is sort of like a heavily reduced stage of my bookshelf, because last May I did like a full Marie Kondo of like, if it doesn't spark joy, throw it out. And part of it was just me recognizing that I have a penchant for collecting too many books. And so what you see here was originally on those shelves that are kind of formed in the corner. We were in a different office. And so it was like, that was max capacity for that shelf. And so this was my office books. I have some books at home, but not a ton of books. Like I don't have a huge bookshelf at home. And I just decided I'm like going to do away with the boxes of books in my basement that I like. Sometimes I would buy another copy of a book that was in there because I did not realize that I still had that book. So I just decided this is a silly way of doing things. So I did a huge purge. And my basic criteria for purging the books was like, if it was a book that I wasn't like thrilled about, like it didn't spark joy, to use the, formal methodology there, then I got rid of it. But then also books where I thought it would be easy to reacquire it. So popular nonfiction books tend to get axed more than like academic books or out of print monographs and things like that, because I felt for the latter ones, well, if I need to cite something in it, it's going to be very difficult to like search through it and find it and this kind of stuff. And then of course we also have my digital books. And I've since this purge last May, I've been like very aggressively like digital whenever possible. I do like physical books, but it's just recognizing this tendency in myself for like, I'm going to be swimming in books in a year or two if I just buy every book paper that I want to read. And so I think that's sort of been my strategy. So this is like, it looks a little sparse right now because we moved to a new office that has like basically twice the shelf space. So that was maybe a month ago. So I've only added a few books since then. And so we have there's room for expansion right now. Although I got to be very careful about that, because every time I get a bigger bookshelf, I tell myself, okay, I'm going to buy all these books now, and it takes a very short amount of time to fill up. So I got to be careful. But the organization of the bookshelf is alphabetical by first author, last name. So I tried to organize it that way. That was also born out of a moment of frustration. I used to just have the books kind of on the shelf somewhat randomly. And I remember when I was researching for my last book in particular, where I was often referencing books that I had read in the past like year or so. And I would spend like, 5 minutes here, 10 minutes here, just like trying to find some of these books on the shelf. Like, is it even here? Is it at my house? So this shift to like doing everything alphabetical by author made it like real fast if I can tell like, oh, do I have the book here? Is it not here? Or, maybe I read it on Kindle, or maybe I read it some other way. It was like a PDF or something. So that was mostly a move to preserve my sanity. And yeah, this is sort of a curated subset of books that I have, and I'm happy to answer any questions you want about them.
So we also have a fun kind of memory lane photo. This
Yeah,
is the
wow.
MIT challenge,
Mhm.
inspired a lot of people and was sort of one of the biggest things you've done on the internet, got a lot of attention. So maybe you could,
Way back in the
for
day,
people that
yeah.
aren't familiar with this or maybe haven't thought about it in a while, I think you said it was 15 years. I asked you, I just
Yeah, it
thought
was
of it while we were doing the
2011,
pre-call.
2011. So yeah, we're now like 2011 is when I started. So we're like close to 15 years ago is when I started that. So, oh, look at me and more hair. Um, no, this stack right here is the textbooks that I used, and also some notebooks you can see on the top of that. And some interesting notes about this. Well, I don't know whether they're interesting, but there's some notes about this. Is that, well, first of all, a lot of the courses I never bought the textbook because it had lectures and stuff. So this is not like every textbook you would have as an MIT student. It was
I
very
think that's
much like,
Russell and Norvig, right?
yeah, it's still here. It should be. I didn't throw
Oh,
that one
wow.
out.
Yeah, it's classic.
But then a lot of these books are not actually real books. They are like the PDF textbook that was included with the course notes that I illegally printed using Lulu Press because I didn't want to go through a PDF. So you see those like black coil ring ones. Those are like course notes that I got printed. And then there's one down at the bottom, which I don't think I still possess. It was not one of my, it did not spark joy. But there's that one, that big one above Ohanian, that's sort of like a beige color.
Mm.
That one there, you know what? I don't even remember the name of it, but it was like a electronics engineering sort of, 500, 600 page beast of a course notes that I got printed off. So that's also, I don't know, maybe the copyright police are going to get in trouble with it, but like if you can find books that you're interested in or course notes, getting them like printed is sometimes nice too. And I've done that before if I have to study things off of this. And we were also talking about other, quasi illegal things that I'm sad are no longer the case. But there used to be a thing a few years back. I think it was called maybe Internet Archive. I don't remember exactly what it was called, but basically this library in the States was just like putting this PDF viewer online so you could just read books for free. And the book publishers did not take kindly to that, and they took it down, which makes me sad because I used it a lot when I was researching Get Better at Anything, especially for like super old academic books that like you can't buy them on Amazon, or they're on Amazon and they cost like $2,000 or something ridiculous. So so I use that quite a bit. But so that is also unfortunate because some of my favorite books, that's how I read them. And so now I have no access to them anymore. So like Albert Bandura's Social Cognitive Theory, I think is the name of that book. That one, or Social Learning Theory, maybe. Like that book is great and I'd love to reference it again, but I'm going to have to buy it if I want it and find some, old copy of it, or Daniel Kahneman's Attention and Effort. These are like great books, but they're, can't even buy them, right? Like it's just a shame. So,
Okay, so
all right.
jumping into the first shelf here.
Start A for, A for what's the first one there? We got Aaronson. Yeah, that's oh, what's this? You flipped it the other way around. I was going to say, what's going on?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's Scott Aaronson's book, Quantum Computing Since Democritus. That's a fun book. I mean, I feel like you need to be a computer science student to appreciate it. It's like challenging mathematically. It's like based on a lecture series he did to University Waterloo, but really fun stuff like about, like how would a computer work if time travel is real and things like that. So I don't know. There's a lot of fun stuff in there. And Scott Aaronson has a great blog too. If you're interested, he has a lot of stuff about like his essay on the Busy Beaver numbers is an internet classic. Highly recommended to anyone with any math inclination. And then, I mean, if you want me to just go through them all, the macroeconomics book, I think I did that during the MIT challenge. That was probably the textbook I used for macro. This Abramowitz, I think is how you say his name, not Abramowitz. Exposure Therapy for Anxiety is a bit of an academic textbook, but really, really good for this theory of the way we overcome fears is by exposing ourselves to it. So I think, it's just a really underrated tool. A lot of people, I think, in our popular culture have this sort of attitude towards fears, and that, you want to protect yourself from it. That something makes you feel uncomfortable, makes you feel anxious, that the correct sort of psychologically healthy thing to do is to shield yourself from that. And basically, the accumulated research says that that is not true, even in cases where, it seems like that's a sensible approach. So this is a really good book, I think, I really like books where they give a robust scientific viewpoint, which pushes against the kind of dominant cultural paradigm. Yeah. Computation, Human Experience. That's a great one. I don't know whether I still agree with the thesis, but the basic idea is just that it's him borrowing on a lot of continental philosophers, particularly Dreyfus's exegesis on Heidegger and about like how that compares with AI systems. And I think it's one of those things where it's a little bit of a relic of the past because the way AI works is very different from how it was working when it was written. So it's more of a critique of that era, but it informed a lot of my thinking on like, how do you think about cognitive science?
Like more symbolic.
Well, yeah, it was basically I found this book through David Chapman. David Chapman has a great online kind of hypertext book called Meaningness. And he sort of talks about how he was this AI researcher, and then he was at MIT as this AI researcher, and he just like left the field to become like this sort of Buddhist monk
Wow.
because of Philip Agre and like his critique of like the AI paradigm. But basically the idea being that the theory dominant at the time was that like cognition worked mostly by manipulating symbols and making these sort of explicit references to things. And it had this whole background problem, which is that like you have to have almost sort of an infinite amount of knowledge or a seemingly infinite amount of knowledge in order to like even solve basic common sense problems. And I don't think that we're at the end of the run for AI now, but I do think like a lot of those critiques, they are somewhat resolved a little bit by the current AI paradigm where you just really do have this enormous amount of knowledge sort of baked into these systems in order to do very simple things. So there's a little bit of a like, this is kind of arguing against a paradigm for cognitive science that was dominant in the like late 80s and stuff. And it's also this sort of fusion between um weird fusion between like esoteric, um like Heidegger and Sartre and these kind of like existentialist philosophers who sort of
Wow.
arguing about being and big weighty concepts like that. And then uh you know AI researchers in the 1980s who are making like robots to do very simple tasks. So it's kind of a funny book today. Um, yeah, I don't know, other books too, like, yeah, Vanishing into Things by Allen, that's sort of the argument that the kind of basic difference in East Asian, particularly Chinese epistemology and sort of Western epistemology is that um, the Westerns, particularly with Plato, very focused on being, this idea of like things, the sort of nouns, I guess you could say, of the world, whereas the Chinese philosophy was very much focused on becoming, or not like these sort of Platonic ideals, but sort of how things actually are in the universe and how they sort of, um, I don't know, it's a little bit difficult to talk about some of these philosophical ideas without having the background, but like things sort of how they manifest as kind of concrete reality rather than sort of abstract types. And this sort of just basic different emphasis on thinking and how it changes how they think about what it means to know things, what it means to learn things about the world. Very different. So it's sort of, yeah, I've got a few books that are kind of about like comparative philosophy on this bookshelf. So that's one of them that I think when I read it like many years ago, and it was one of those ones where I read it and I didn't have the background knowledge to really understand the thesis. So it was like, ooh, this is interesting. What is this being and becoming thing? And then you read a little bit more philosophy. And you're like, okay, I maybe I should go back and reread it now that I understand a little bit more what he's talking about.
Sounds like
Um,
it maybe was related to your learning challenge, your language learning challenge.
Yeah, I think it was more an after effect of that. I think
Oh,
after I learned Chinese to some extent, I became interested in a lot. So we'll get to it maybe on the bookshelf tour, but like I have a biography of Deng Xiaoping. I have a number of books about China or Asia. I have a number of books that didn't even make it through the purge about China. So I think, it's you sort of you start investing in learning about a culture or a language or this kind of thing, and it just sort of opens you up to this world. So, I'm kind of inclined to like, oh, I wouldn't mind picking up a book that will talk about like the Song Dynasty. Whereas, if you asked me for pick some other country random, like, something about the history of Iran or Persia or something like that. I just don't know enough to like want to like gravitate towards that book. So there is this kind of compounding idea that like you go down these rabbit holes in part because you know enough to like make it interesting for you.
mhm.
And then we got a big set of Anderson books. Yeah, Bob Anderson. He is one of the people that I was impressed with most when I was doing um, the last book, Get Better at Anything. Like he's been basically working his whole life on this sort of unified theory of like cognitive psychology called ACT R, or I think that's what it's called right now. But it was basically trying to simulate what is cognition actually like by integrating all these different psychological theories. So this Learning and Memory is a really good textbook because it kind of shows. So just for like, there's a little bit of background even in that title there that he sort of spans his career sort of spanned the the transition from behaviorism to cognitive psychology. And so behaviorism was very focused on learning, and cognitive psychology was very much focused on memory. And they sound very similar, but really they're kind of almost two completely different paradigms for looking at behavioral phenomena or psychological phenomena. So behaviorism was all about reinforcement. It was all about how, you create changes in the environment that results in this sort of black box learning that changes the behavior of the organism. And memory was sort of like, well, what is in the black box? And that sort of shift in focus, that shift in paradigm was huge. And so this textbook really covers that transition, and Anderson sort of being on both sides of it, and kind of documenting a lot of these psychological results. And it's just sort of a gold mine of like basic theory of, how does memory work? How does learning work? Like all sorts of curves and graphs and laws and this kind of stuff. And so I've always really admired Anderson because he's the kind of person where he's trying to synthesize, he's trying to bring together a lot of different findings in different fields and integrate them into like, well, it all has to be in one system, right? Like the brain is just one thing. Whereas we have this sort of real plurality of psychological theories that just goes everywhere. And so he's trying to bring it all together. So I really admire that. And then rules of the mind, cognitive skills and their acquisition, atomic components of thought are just kind of, I don't know this sequence. I should actually have organized them by date there, but I think Atomic Components of Thought is the most recent of these 3 books. But there's also a book that's the first author is Mark Singley, which will be later in the bookshelf, but they're also of the same thing. And they're basically iterations on this ACT-R cognitive theory, which admittedly right now is a little anachronistic because it's basically completely different from the deep learning paradigm that's in vogue right now. And indeed, like I would say the turn toward neuroscience that's dominant in psychology as well. So it may end up being the case that like this is sort of a, an interesting exploration, but actually like a bit of a dead end theoretically. Although I think just the fact that he's managed to support a lot of these theories empirically quite well suggests that there's still something useful to learn from it, even if the actual like, a little bit like how like Newtonian mechanics is still useful, even if like it's ultimately not the description of reality. You need like general relativity. It may be the case that like ACT-R is like ultimately false, like it's just not how the brain works, but it models, aspects of like learning well enough that, it's useful for thinking about things like acquiring skills and acquiring knowledge and learning math and maybe even learning languages and stuff. So it's an interesting theory to think about. And then we've
Yeah,
got
I
this.
mean, I think
Yeah,
how some of these LLMs are able to, behind the scenes, like
yeah,
if you ask them a math problem, they will code that into like a Python structure and then use Python or some other programming language to do the math and then spit out an answer. So, or even generate code, which is deterministic. So I think we're already seeing sort of a swing of the pendulum.
Well, yeah, I think it's one of these things where like the old paradigm gets replaced, and it doesn't mean that the old paradigm, a lot of the findings were wrong. It's just that people have like reorganized their thinking. There's like been a reshuffle of the conceptual hierarchy. So like you can see that in psychology is such a great case study for this. What is science and how does it work? Because you have so many revolutions that are kind of in contemporary time. So if you think back to like it starts with the introspectionists, with William James and some of these early people where like doing psychology was like basically doing philosophy, maybe being a little bit more mechanistic about it or this kind of thing. It was a lot of like reflecting on your own conscious experience or your own behavior or this kind of thing. And then you have the behaviorists that are like really trying to stamp out that unrigorous character and make it, explicit and law-like and physics-like. But in doing so, maybe going a little too far and banishing a lot of ideas and concepts that are really necessary to make study of thinking work. And then you have Noam Chomsky basically attacking Skinner for, and sort of kicking off the cognitive revolution and this shift towards like sort of the computer model of modeling the brain in terms of computer states and this kind of thing. And now you have almost a sort of like a retreat to sort of neo-behaviorism where you have like the trend towards neuroscience and the fact that a lot of these sort of like highly parameterized neural models and this kind of stuff are a little bit like black boxes that do kind of work on a little bit of these behaviorist principles. Like I think it's Rescorla, I'm maybe mispronouncing it, and Wagner, they had this like basically like very early kind of neural net sort of model, and it was like sort of a behaviorist theory. And like this is sort of, it's just like a weird like, so you see this kind of reshuffling as people. It's sort of like people that, you know, the 3 old man feeling the elephant, and the one touches the tusks and says like it's hard and smooth, and the other one touches the leg and it's like it's thick and wrinkly, and one touches the tail and it's, you know, it's wispy, and it is a little bit like that too. I think that, you know, every once in a while someone changes the field and changes what paradigm is going to be used and what's going to be studied. And so, you know, I think reading the history of science in these fields gives you a certain amount of humility for where we are right now. That like, you know, what are the chances this is the last one, right? What are the chances we're going to go, okay, now this is going to be the one that lasts for, you know, a few centuries. Oh, hold on, sorry. I adjusted my headphones and my music from my phone I was listening to came on. Yeah, so what is the chances that that's going to be the final paradigm here? So I think that's a useful thing to think about here. And this Atkinson and Birch one, which you can see the title has become faded off completely, probably due to, you know, it sitting on my bookshelf and getting sunlight every day. But that one is called Introduction to Motivation. And it's a good book, maybe a little bit old. I think I wouldn't recommend it to someone these days because, you know, I don't know when it's published, but it's a little bit old. But it's good for giving a good history of like motivational psychology, and in particular, you know, Atkinson and Birch's idea that, you know, so much of motivational research in the beginning, especially the behaviorist days, was this sort of what initiates behavior and what, you know, why do people do certain things? Whereas Atkinson and Birch argue that, well, the key idea about behavior is that it's always happening. And so the real question of motivation is, why do we change what we're doing? Why do we stop doing something and do something else? Because that's always what it is to think about motivation. So it's sort of an interesting book, and they cover a lot of research. I've become a little bit less enamored of some of Atkinson's theories, you know, more recently. You know, I think that he was probably wrong about some stuff, but it is I think it's, you know, anytime you get a textbook, even if the author is totally wrong in their opinions about things, the textbook is usually pretty good because they're kind of required to present other people's ideas semi-fairly. Whereas if you get like a popular nonfiction book or some kind of, you know, very like polemical kind of academic book, you can get a really distorted picture. Whereas something where like this is going to be used in a classroom to teach the class, they kind of have to present opposing viewpoints semi-fairly, even if they're somewhat critical of them. So I do appreciate buying textbooks. I feel like they're lower risk purchases, whereas you can definitely buy books where this book you're going to know less than you knew before you started, because you're going to go down this rabbit hole that's going to take you in the wrong direction.
We've also got a UTM here.
UTM, sorry.
Undergraduate text in mathematics.
Oh yeah, so this is an example of a book that I have not done anything from. I think it's Strang. This is Axler? I thought it was Gilbert Strang's book. Maybe he recommended this book, but this was like highly recommended as a very good linear algebra book. And linear algebra is like one of those things that I did study, but I'm like, I should go back and learn it better because I feel like I don't have a great intuition of it. And so that's an IOU right there. I've not actually read that book, but it's like, one day. Where are we now? Okay. Look at us. Now we're into the B's. Man, this is going to take a while. Baddeley, I got 2 books. I've got his human memory textbook. Baddeley, of course, you know, so now we're talking about the cognitive transition. He's now firmly in the cognitive psychology camp, and Baddeley is like one of the great researchers for memory. He created the concept of working memory. His book, Working Memories, an excellent pun. I love it when people can do great puns, is sort of memoir, which sounds like it would be more boring than it actually is, but he has like this fascinating life, and it's very interesting. I think sometimes that historical or biographical aspect of science gets missed in textbooks, and it's so important because it contextualizes it. Like it explains why he was working on certain problems, what he was thinking at the time, this sort of trajectory of science. But Human Memory is a great book for just if you want. Yeah, I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in memory. I think it's, I don't know the author's name, Baumgartner. Speaking Minds is this is a very early book I read when I was just starting to learn about cognitive psychology, cognitive science. It's basically just a compilation of, I don't know whether it's interviews or whether it's edited chapters. I don't remember, but it's a bunch of different authors talking about cognitive science and their perspective. And I read it. I have not read it recently. I read it like years ago, and I read it at a time when I didn't know that much. And so it was like kind of an introduction to me. This is Bereiter. He is a great educational psychologist. In this book, Education of Mind in the Knowledge Age, he's sort of an interesting guy because he did some of the early work on direct instruction. So he sort of has that as a bit of a background, but he's kind of made a little bit more of a constructivist turn in
Could you
his work.
define
So
that, direct instruction?
yeah, sure. So we'll probably get to it somewhere in this thing, but direct instruction is the idea that it's a little bit more like what people stereotype as like what classrooms are like, even though no classroom today is actually like this. But it's this idea that, the kids sit in the classroom and the teacher teaches them very explicitly, this is what you do, and you do drills and you sort of build up fluency in the basics and you solve harder problems, but it's all very directed. It's whereas the constructivism is this idea that no, you can't teach students anything. They have to like discover it for themselves. And so you have to have these open environments where kids can play and figure out the principles through deduction. And it's one of those romantic ideas that when you talk to people who are not familiar with the research, the constructivist idea gets a lot of like support. And certainly I would say a naive reading of the literature gives it support too, because there's all sorts of badly designed ed psych studies which seem to suggest constructivism works. But I think all the good research basically shows that, people learn better when you actually teach them things, and that things being too difficult is a major reason people don't learn stuff. And so the fact that direct instruction breaks things down and makes it simpler and builds up fluency in the basics before moving on to the more advanced stuff is very powerful. But Bereiter kind of talks a little bit about different senses of knowledge, and he sort of talking about like the idea that we should be trying to get students in this mindset of creating knowledge. So he's sort of like a kind of a project-based learning approach. I don't know whether I agree with him on this as being like, this is what we should be doing to reform education. I definitely lean more towards the direct instruction school of thought, but I think, he has such a large history. So I have a number of books by Bereiter, but I don't think they're here. I think this is the only one I kept. But he's an interesting guy because he has such a long history in the field. And so, it's just very interesting to get his perspective on lots of stuff. So he's integrating lots of different research and kind of throwing cold water on certain people, enthusiasts and various people like that. So it's a good read. This logic book would have been an MIT challenge book. These next two would have been MIT challenge books that, so I did them to some extent when I was doing the MIT challenge. So the logic book was probably intro logic, maybe predicate calculus, and then the introduction to probability, just a basic probability textbook. I don't have particular memories about them, but I do remember doing those classes. This investments textbook I did recently in my foundations project. I read about maybe 60 to 70% of it. It's pretty good. I think, I don't know, part of the problem is that I'm kind of philosophically opposed to doing a lot of active investing. I'm very much a passive index investor. And so I kind of skipped the whole section on like, analyzing company fundamentals and stuff, because I was like, I'm just not going to engage in this. But
What's your
it was
philosophy?
interesting. Sorry?
What's your philosophy?
Oh, index investing is basically the idea that the market, if not being totally efficient, is at least, it's very difficult to make positive returns over the just basically invest in all the stocks and then just average it out. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but index investing is this idea that because when a stock has favorable future outcomes, people buy it, that bids up the price. There's a sense in which it's difficult to identify in advance, oh, this company is going to succeed more than it's already priced in, or this company is going to fail more than it's already priced in. And so this idea is that, most people who try to pick stocks end up making less money. And there's probably some people that have stock picking skill, but I think the idea is that the average non-institutional investor who's not working on Wall Street, who doesn't have like an army of physics PhDs and access to the supercomputers that can front run the market, this kind of stuff. If you don't have that, it's going to be very difficult to make a profit. And so, it just sort of undermines this idea of doing this kind of like, well, I'm going to look at their P&L and be like, this company's undervalued because it has this inventory ratio, or all this kind of financial analysis stuff. So this investments book is not mostly about that. I would say it actually mostly supports the viewpoint I'm arguing for index investing. But some of the stuff is maybe a little bit old, like puts a lot of weight on kind of the historical of like the CAPM, which is the capital asset pricing model. And that's something you learn in investing, but it's also kind of like, it's the theory that everyone uses, but it's also a terrible theory. Like it doesn't actually predict anything. And so there is stuff like that where maybe I would have liked to have had a little bit more, this is what the current state of the field is, because it's maybe not super useful. It's more just kind of like if you were to get into investing and understanding financial markets and stuff, it would give you some of that basics. Bransford, Human Cognition, another book. He's sort of also, I would say, in the kind of constructivist camp. I don't recall too much about this particular book. I think I read some of it, but it was definitely part of my Get Better at Anything research. The Brown Larson-Hall Second Language Acquisition Myths. Great book. I don't know. I like these kind of books that are sort of short and they give you kind of a brief window into a field. So SLA research is one that I did a bit of a deep dive on. This would have been a couple years ago. And I did a post, I think it was, what does research say is the best way to learn a language? And I kind of present some of this stuff from books I read. And I think it's one of those things where like the research quality to me is not so compelling that like you're forced to admit what it says. But I think this second language acquisition myths does at least show like, okay, well, at least we have some evidence that these ideas are wrong. So I don't remember all of the myths, but I do remember one which stood out to me, which was that the idea that children learn languages much faster than adults, which is something that everyone thinks. It's true that they learn the grammar, especially the grammar and also the pronunciation. They learn it to a higher degree of accuracy over the long haul, but they actually learn it fairly slowly. And it's probably the case that like the cognitive mechanisms that underlie adult language learning are much more powerful and faster. They just don't reach that perfected state that little kids can, especially with pronunciation. It seems to be the case that, you will acquire a native accent in almost all cases if you learn it at a very young age in an immersive environment, which it is very rare to do that as an adult. But if you're just to say like, okay, you have 6 months of an hour a day of study, who's going to do better? The 4-year-olds or the 40-year-olds? The 40-year-olds will probably do better. They'll learn more after, just because they're, smarter, grown up, they can use studying strategies, that kind of stuff. Complete Guide to Fitness and Health, that was another foundations book. Great book. I think it's important because exercise is super underrated for not just health, but also cognition and things like this. So I spent a lot of time learning about learning, and I would say, for the average person, if you went running every day, that would probably be better than most of the learning technique advice that you find online.
Yep.
The Case Against Education, probably the most persuasive book that I find I don't want to agree with, but it's a very good case for the idea of the signaling model of education. So signaling model basically is that you can imagine different versions of why do people earn more money when they go to college. So one is the human capital story, which is that college teaches you useful stuff. You become more productive as an employee. That makes you earn more. So that's certainly true in some cases. I'm sure a doctor who goes to medical school is more productive than someone who does not. An engineer, this kind of thing. But certainly it doesn't explain why someone who's an art history major out-earns someone who's not an art history major when they're not doing art history. And that's something we see. And so the other one is the ability story, which is just that smarter people just go to college, so they would have earned more money anyways. That also seems to be somewhat against the facts. And the signaling model is the somewhat cynical model that, well, what it is that school doesn't make you any better at any work skill, but it signals to employers that you're smart, or also in Caplan's thing, conscientious and conformist. And those three things together mean that you're more likely to be a good candidate. So people are more willing to hire you and give you money and promote you and this kind of thing. And so this is sort of you go to school to get the diploma and not the education, which is sort of like the antithesis of my MIT challenge. So I don't 100% agree with it. And I think I don't think that it's as solid an argument as it was when I first read it, but I do also think, something like it is at least partly true. And it's definitely good to heed as an argument as well, because if you have the idea that, oh, well, it's all about learning and this kind of stuff, well, it's pretty clear that a lot of people are just going to college for the degree, and the degree does actually make a difference. Spen Carpenter book. This was, so nutrition and like health books in general are terrible. And I feel like one of my major pain points as someone who has occasionally written about this topic is the amount of people who are like deep down the rabbit hole of like some super heterodox opinion that is not supported by science. And so this is very much an example where, like, if you go to a random health and fitness section and you pick a book at random, there is a good chance you'll end up dumber than you started, because you're going to pick a book where someone has like some non-mainstream viewpoint, and you're going to spend all your time reading it and learning it and not realize all the good counter arguments for it. And so I have just been very disillusioned with popular health books, particularly with nutrition. And so there is this great website called redpenreviews.org. It's a nonprofit where they have scholars actually read these popular books and give them ratings on like whether they conform to current guidelines, whether they are scientifically accurate, whether they actually cite their sources properly, which you'd be surprised lots of books don't do. And so this book by Ben Carpenter was like one of the top books. So meaning that, for whatever the takeaway is, it's fairly accurate to science. And I thought it was a good book because, like as a lot of people did when I started getting into my late 20s, I started gaining a little bit of weight. I was a little bit heavier in the cheeks and in the belly and this kind of stuff. And losing weight is incredibly hard, and most people fail at it. And so I think there is a lot of oversold promises on like you can do X, Y, or Z and lose a lot of weight. So this book was a really good like ground truth. What does the research say about losing weight? I would say that the pessimistic thing that most people who try to lose weight will fail is probably true. So I'm definitely not one of these diet influencers, but I think if you are going to try to lose weight, you should at least be aware of what it is. So this is a good book to recommend for people if that is a goal of yours. All right. Yeah, this is the B's. Now we're into the C's. Oh yeah, I've got, so yeah, example. I didn't realize I was including my Spanish ones here, but this is Cervantes, so Don Quixote de la Mancha. I have not read this one. Turns out it's actually like too hard for my Spanish level. It's like, sort of the like Spanish equivalent of like Shakespearean English. So I was not able to read it, but I still have hopes that one day I will get to it. Yeah, that one's backwards for some reason. And then mathematics of poker. There was a little while where I was doing a little programming side project where I wanted to make an AI that could play poker. And so I got onto this book, and reading this book made me realize that I am not intellectually equipped to make that program, that it's actually like mathematically optimal poker is much more complicated than I had appreciated when I started the project. But it was a very interesting book because it's all talking about game theory and how how basically how sophisticated some of the strategies are that people use who are like professional poker players. But I don't have a gambling streak, so it's very much theoretical knowledge for me. Industrial organization, great economics topic. I think it's basically the sort of next level up after you would be going from sort of your basic microeconomics class. Talks a lot about like how firms behave, especially in sort of more realistic real world scenarios where there aren't, infinite perfect competition, and, sort of talks about various kinds of strategies, and again, also very game theory oriented. And then I think the book that you can't quite see there is Neurophilosophy by Patricia Churchland. And she's a philosopher who actually did like some brain work. Like she worked with neuroscience. And so she's sort of, I would say she's in like the hard materialism camp of philosophers that like basically we're going to find out that everything is just meat and atoms and whatever down in the end. And so she's very much in the kind of neuroscience tradition, but she's combining that with philosophy of mind, with philosophy of some of these other concepts. Computational brain. She wrote this book with Sinowski. Sinowski is the sort of the scientist in the field. He actually is also co-author of a course called Learning How to Learn that is co-taught by one of my friends, Barbara Oakley. And Sinowski is one of the pioneers of this whole deep learning paradigm that we're all in there. So this computational brain is like one of those early foundational books. I would say that in parallel distributed processing. These are like illustrating the basic principles of deep learning, but as a model for understanding how the brain actually works.
Hmm.
Gregor Clark, Farewell to Alms. I don't remember as much about this one as his The Sun Also Rises. All of his books are Hemingway puns, which is, I don't know, again, it's just, I love it when people have puns. But he's a great kind of economic historian and sort of talking about economic development. The Sun Also Rises is the one that struck me in particular because I don't know whether I have it here or whether it's, I don't know where I read it. Because I don't know whether it's obviously not on my bookshelf, but The Sun Also Rises is SON, and it's just talking about how if you look at rare surnames, so people who have very unusual names, so they're almost certainly related to each other in the history, there's way more regression to the mean in terms of ability than you would expect for people of particular. Sorry, maybe regression to the mean is not the right way to put it. Back up. The sort of predominant theory of the time was that there's not actually that much heritability of social status and education and wealth, because you look at these correlations intergenerationally, so like fathers and sons or grandfathers and grandsons, and they're not that correlated. But his finding was that actually, if you take the longer view with this sort of low frequency surname approach, they're actually really correlated. And so it's the case that, over the long run, people sort of go back to their kind of like hereditary baseline, which has a very kind of stark kind of, I would say, like genetic determinist sort of viewpoint. But it's an interesting sort of set of research. So I wouldn't say that it's like knockdown, but it's definitely was a compelling book when I read it. Atomic Habits. Oh, James Clear, he did the foreword for my book. This book is just like so unbelievably popular. It was a great book when I read it. I did not realize it was going to become the book of the century when I first read it, but definitely when I read it, I was like, oh yeah, James wrote a pretty good book.
Which book did he write the
So,
foreword for?
for Ultralearning.
Okay.
For Ultralearning, which was sort of at the stage of his career where I can still get James Clear to write a foreword for my book. Which I probably still get sales because people search James Clear and then my book shows up because he's like an author on the
Nice.
page. So it's just wild. But I mean, Atomic Habits is a great kind of great introductory book to the science of habits. And I think Clear did a good job.
How did you know
Um,
him well enough to like ask him
Yeah,
to
well,
write your
so
foreword?
the funny thing is that like I knew him well before he was like writing all that much, and he actually reached out to me. We were like, I think we were like chumming around in Portland for Chris Gilbo's World Domination Summit, and he like showed up, and he was like a tag along, like he was like new. He didn't like he had started writing, but he wasn't like a big shot or anything. And I remember hanging out with him and Benny Lewis and a few other people. We kind of became friends, and I went on a retreat with him and stuff, um and like it was pretty clear even then. I was like, oh yeah, this guy's writing is good. Like he's going places. Like I didn't realize how much he was going places, but yeah, like now, I mean, now it's funny. I recently was invited on a podcast where basically the host wanted me to talk about Atomic Habits. And I was like, all right, you couldn't pick James Clear, so now you got this guy to like talk about his book. It was a little bit like, all right, but I mean, as I said, I think these kind of phenomenal sensational bestseller kind of things like Atomic Habits or Mark Manson's Subtle Art or 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, like they're almost, they're just the snowball effect. They just kind of become these cultural phenomena. So I would still recommend it as a book to people, and I think it's a great book. But it's almost impossible to live up to that hype when you have that level of success as a book. So yeah, speaking of, I got the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People just 2 books over. And then that Essentials of Personal Training was another foundations book that I read. Um, Tyler Cowen's book, What Price Fame. I got him to sign this one. I met him for lunch in DC, and so this one has a special place in my heart because
Did
he
you
signed it.
ask him anything interesting when you talked to him, or?
Oh man, he is one of the few people that I've had a conversation with where like the feeling of intellectual inferiority just washes over you, because like, god damn, this guy knows everything. Like he is an LLM. Like it is like talking to ChatGPT. Like the amount that he can just like pull up something that he knows, like just to some incredible amount of depth, and his just knowledge is so broad and vast that you feel almost sheepish trying to talk to him. But yeah, I remember getting some food with him and one of his producers of his podcast. And he's a very nice guy too, very congenial. I first interacted with him, I think I had interacted with him because I was citing him in Ultralearning. So I was like, okay, I want to confirm that I'm going to follow best practice of Bryan Caplan's practice of like email all the authors you cited and ask them if you cited their work correctly, which is very good because very often they will say no. And they'll pick up some persnickety detail that you totally overlooked that like, okay, you said that wrong. But I remember talking to him like initially because he was traveling in China and I was there in China and stuff. And so yeah, Tyler Cowen is definitely one of my intellectual aspirations to just be as well read as him.
He's got a
Times
great podcast
0.01 would be an achievement.
Got a great podcast, great set of guests on the podcast.
Oh, amazing. Yeah. No, but
Can
I
you say
mean,
a couple words about Bryan Caplan?
Oh yeah, Bryan Caplan, he's the one who did the Case Against Education, so that was a little bit back in the thing. But Bryan Caplan works with Tyler Cowen at George Mason University. He's a very prominent, I would say, like kind of libertarian thinker. Somewhat controversial. Like I would say, I really admire Bryan Caplan for his like, he has this kind of ability to make arguments somewhat fearlessly, despite them being like not, politically correct or politically popular. But I don't always agree with him on everything. Whereas Tyler Cowen's almost the opposite. He's just sort of like, he's almost inscrutable to know what he really thinks about things sometimes. Like he really likes taking like the meta of the conversation about something. So it's harder to suss out what Tyler Cowen really thinks about things, but Cowen has a lot of great books. His best book is probably Average is Over, which very much anticipates our current AI age that we're entering into. It's one of the best books for understanding that. But this What Price Fame is really the sort of an economist's perspective on fame and status, and basically the idea that status we are used to thinking of as being a kind of zero-sum game, and he argues that it's not, that lots of things are both competitive but not near zero-sum. And this is some interesting ideas there about like about these kind of things. But Cowen's written a lot of books, and I even have some on my like to-do list to read right now. So maybe when we get to the Kindle, maybe one of his books is on there. Working Minds, about cognitive task analysis, great little subfield about how do you actually know what people are thinking? How do experts actually do what they're doing? Gerard Klein, one of the sort of pioneers or central figures in this kind of naturalistic decision-making field. And his work was very central in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink. So, his study of firefighters made it as a chapter in there. So there's a little bit of a connection there. Flow, Cheek Set Me High. That's a great book. I think this is one book where it's, again, it's not Atomic Habits level famous maybe, but it has this sort of popular connotation that I think is at odds with what he actually wrote in the book. So flow, when you talk about it, I would say colloquially, means this kind of effortless, easy state of like, you're kind of in the zone, you're not having to like work too hard, you're kind of like absorbed in what you're doing. And there has been this kind of pushback, both academically and I would say sort of punditry wise, that like, well, you need to do deliberate practice and it's harder than that. I know Cal Newport has been kind of critical of flow. I just listened to a podcast with Dorkesh and Michael Nielsen, and Michael Nielsen's pushing back on this. But actually, if you go through flow, like Cheek Set Me High's book, it's not clear that that's what he's talking about when he's talking about flow. Like he's kind of talking about people who are sort of elite performers that are extremely goal-driven and ambitious and kind of almost obsessed with the work that they're doing. It's not obvious to me that he's talking about this like easy, effortless psychological state, or at least that's not what the book that he's talking about is about, whether or not that actually bears on his construct of flow that he kind of defines psychologically. But so it's an interesting book to read because I feel like there's actually a lot more compatibility between flow, as he discusses in the book, and ideas like deliberate practice than there sort of appears to be from the kind of common sense interpretation. So a great book. Flow's a great book. And Cheek Set Me High is also a really, maybe an underrated researcher too. I think he has a lot of good contributions in the fields of creativity as well. He has a lot of stuff that he's written about that. And I've enjoyed a lot of his discussions.
Is K. Anders Ericsson later on here? Is there anything from him?
Well, he would be an E. Yeah. So what do I have here? Yeah, I've got a couple Ericsson books.
Okay. Because I was going to say
3 Ericsson books in E. And those are the ones that I actually have physical copies of, right? And this Mason Curry book, I don't know how I picked it up, but it's just like different routines that like famous people followed. I think I got it when I was researching Get Better at Anything and I wanted like stories. And so I was like, okay, this is a good maybe like starting place. It's amazing how much time I waste writing books trying to find stories for stuff. And that's something I want to reflect on in my own writing process, because there's something feels artificial about that. Like I'm very interested in the science, but I kind of feel like, you know, when I talk about ultra learning, all people want to talk about is like stories and examples. You know, there isn't nearly as much interest in like the science and the theories. And so definitely when I was doing Get Better at Anything, I was like, God, okay, like I'm very interested in this theory. Let's go find some sort of story to intro it or to introduce it or to bring it into the fold. And
But
so
that's
I don't
sort of
know.
the
I
trade-off
think,
you make when you go with a traditional publishers. They want you to do that.
well, I don't know that they want you to do it. It's just the style, right? And that's one thing I've been kind of questioning privately is like, is that actually a good style? Is that like, is it something that, you know, like I'm cribbing Malcolm Gladwell, but like Malcolm Gladwell, if you like, I took his master class like years back, and it was very clear that like, oh, Malcolm Gladwell just has totally different set of ways of thinking about it and priorities than I do. Like Malcolm Gladwell's all about the story. That's kind of like mostly what he cares about. He's like, this is a great story. I want to tell it. Like I was just thinking about Blink. What's the takeaway from Blink? Like, I don't even know what the takeaway from Blink is. Like, sometimes intuition is good and sometimes it's not good. But like, man, it was such a fascinating, engrossing book. And I think it's just because Malcolm Gladwell loves the stories. He loves the kind of weaving in and out of like, you know, the science and then some counterintuitive example and this kind of stuff. But I feel like he's a lot more about the journey than the destination. And yeah, I just like, I guess to me, that's sort of one of those things that like when you want to write a kind of more prestige popular nonfiction book, okay, it's story, science, takeaway. And you kind of fall into that template a little bit. And I'm certainly not accomplished enough as a writer to be like, okay, I'm going to re-envision the format, but it's definitely something that I've thought about a little bit, just in light of, you know, that it seems a little bit less natural for me. Like it's not what I tend to do when I'm writing blog articles and have more control over my writing.
There's also, he wrote one other book called Daily Rituals, Women at Work.
Oh, okay.
But I
So
did
you can
think it
see
was interesting
here.
he hasn't put out additional books because of, I feel like that's the
Yeah.
kind of thing where you can make a series out of it. But he's got like, I just putting into AI, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Agatha Christie.
Yeah. It is useful. And, you know, I don't know, maybe my brain is hardwired differently. Like, even if you're like looking over this library, like looking at the books that I pick, you know, I'm a bit of a weirdo, right? Like, these are not best-selling books. Like, I had to like work hard to get some of these. They're like out of print. So I have to take that into account, that like
But you are
my
sort of an
taste,
academic in some ways outside of
not really,
academia.
not really. Like, I am very much, like, I'm very aware that I'm not an academic whenever I'm doing all this writing. And I think that humility, you know, bragging about my humility. Look at
But I
me.
mean, you have the
No,
library
but
of an
that humility is
academic.
important because I think it's very easy to convince yourself. I've read a lot. I'm an expert, and you don't realize how much experts actually know. And I've actually read. And if you talk to them, they like shut you up pretty quickly if you have like bad ideas. So I think that helps you, because I think the more when you're writing, you can be it's better if you're careful. It's better if you like take the research seriously and like double check, did that study actually say that? And I think there's a lot of, especially for this kind of writing, it's like, no one's going to check the citation. I'm going to be a little bit loosey-goosey with this, and it's just polluting the informational environment. So I try my best. Yeah, lots of
Well, I
different
think
books
your
here.
ultra learning book in particular, I mean, I kind of, whenever somebody asks me, you know, what's kind of a good way to get an overview of the learning literature, I recommend that book.
Oh,
And it's
well, thank
definitely
you.
been useful for me to kind of, um, you know, kind of make sure I have a baseline of
Yeah.
understanding.
Yeah, well, I try my best. That's all I can say. Yeah, so here's a few books here. We've got Transfer on Trial. This is I bought, so when I was writing Get Better at Anything, my original idea was I wrote this essay called Do the Real Thing, and it was going to be, okay, I'm going to write a book that's about all this research about how transfer is really bad. Basically, transfer is when you learn one thing and you try to apply it to something else. that it tends to be worse than people think, or at least there's a large literature kind of supporting this idea. And so it suggests that if you, one implication of this may be that if you want to get good at something, you should do the thing you're trying to get good at. And I wanted to write a book about this. And I don't think it's an entirely wrong thesis,
Could you
but I
just give
feel
a quick
going down,
example of like what's an example of people thinking they're doing
yeah, like
transfer
doing
but not actually?
Duolingo. You're learning a language, you're playing a game on your phone. You're not actually like interacting with people, right?
Yeah.
That's an example. Or
Or flashcards even.
Yeah, well, yeah. So I would say that I have a more nuanced view right now, because I think doing the real thing is very important, but there are specific instances where it's not as effective, and those tend to be important. So, for instance, if you look at the research on how people learn to read, there was a whole philosophy called whole language instruction, which is essentially what this kind of an applied version of this do the real thing, which is like, okay, well, we want to stop with these phonetics drills and get kids just actually reading books because that's what they want to do. That doesn't work. They work better with the phonetics drills. And so it turns out that, yes, it is the case that transfer is poor, but people learn more when they take complex skills and break them down into smaller parts, learn the components and reintegrate them. That tends to be the case when the skills are cognitively difficult, which is often the case for a lot of these things. Now, so I still think that there is some benefits to this do the real thing, as a philosophy of an idea. So I don't want to throw it completely in the garbage, but I think it was no longer something that I felt like wholeheartedly defending as a sort of like, my 90-second book pitch where I go on podcasts. So I ended up pivoting the whole book. But I did read a ton on transfer because that was the starting point of the project. So I have like lots of books where the starting point was I want to learn everything there is to know about this transfer phenomenon.
It's kind of interesting Sternberg is there because has all the multiple intelligence stuff. And
Yeah.
did you get much
Well,
into like
Sternberg,
intelligence and measuring it and all that?
yeah, I mean, Sternberg's one of these guys where like all of his theories I kind of don't like, but he's actually like a good psychologist. And so when he's talking about other work, I feel like he's careful and clever and this kind of stuff. Like, I don't like his triarchic theory of intelligence. I think it's bad. He also had like, there was another book, I think it was about, I don't know, like he had one on creativity. I kind of like don't like his theories, but whenever he's like weighing in on, so like he's weighing in on transfer here, I think he's like intelligent. Like he's a smart guy, right? That's the thing too. Like even these people who are like academics who have bad theories, they're like incredibly intelligent, right? Like they're not, it's not like they're just, oh, well, it's only the smart people that have good ideas. Like, yeah, lots of smart people have bad ideas too, right? I'm probably in that camp as well. But anyways, this book is just another edited volume about transfer. Detterman, he has, the reason I got this book is that in Caplan, I think, was it Caplan or it was another book, a PDF book, so it won't even be on this tour, by, who is the author of that book? I don't remember, but it's a book about transfer. And Detterman is quoted as being like this extreme transfer skeptic. Basically, Detterman has this like great quote where, oh, I wish I had the quote offhand right now, but let's pull it out. Let's pull this book out while we're at it. Where is this book? Detterman. Let's get it. This is the benefit of having this thing right here. All right, let's read the quote about transfer. I have a feeling we're going over 2 hours, Tim. I'm sorry. I think this is...
Oh, good.
I think we're going to be... Okay, all right, I'm going to read it. All right, everyone listen to Detterman's... look at this. Fiery spitting right now. When I began teaching, I thought it was important to make things as hard as possible for students so they would discover the principles themselves. I thought the discovery of principles was a fundamental skill that students needed to learn and transfer to new situations. Now I view education, even graduate education, as the learning of information. I try to make it as easy for students as possible. Where before I was ambiguous about what a good paper was, I now provide examples of the best papers from past classes. Before, I expected students to infer the general conclusion from specific examples. Now I provide the general conclusion and support it with specific examples. In general, I subscribe to the principle that you should teach people exactly what you want them to learn in a situation as close as possible to the one in which the learning will be applied. I don't count on transfer, and I don't promote it except by explicitly pointing out where taught skills may apply. So that's his perspective on it, which is, I would say if you think about it, like compared to the sort of lofty aims of education, it's a considerably reduced vision, but I think there's a lot of evidence that that's what people get out of school. Like you get out the skills that you actually learn. You get the knowledge you actually learn. Now, I tend to be a little bit more optimistic in that I think people underrate how much knowledge is involved in being smart and being good at things. And so there is a little bit of this, I would say, this fallacy of like, oh, like how important is learning this particular word in Spanish, for Spanish fluency? You almost never use it, right? But it's like, no, but all the words you need to know to be fluent in Spanish. And it's kind of true with learning. So maybe that's sort of the disappointing truth, is that there aren't a few super specific general skills that if you learn them, you'll be good at everything. No, to be smart, to be educated is to know tons and tons of stuff. And it's a lot of work. So there you go. Dreyfus, Mind over Machine. So this is very much in this Philip Agre kind of combining continental philosophy with a critique of AI. I think Dreyfus is wrong, but I think, as a kind of directional critique of symbolic AI, he maybe has some good points. But, I'm not on board with the, like, there's something fundamentally distinctive about human minds over computing systems. Drucker, Effective Executive, just a classic. It's a great one. This is actually the book where it, like, basically introduces the concept of deep work. So it's funny to read, like, no idea comes out of a vacuum. So there's so many times where, like, people will talk about James Clear's Atomic Habits, like he invented this idea of habits or something like that. And so sometimes I've written about habits and people are, oh, you're like, you're referencing James Clear or this kind of thing. I'm like, I literally have the Gmail account, how to change a habit at gmail.com, because I wrote a book called How to Change a Habit like 10 years before that. So it's funny how in the self-help world, ideas are never new. And that includes my ideas. There's always some antecedent. And I think appreciating our historical antecedents is pretty important, because often there's this idea that we want to attribute everything to whoever, you heard it from, but rarely are they the ones who came up with it. Dunning, Self-Insight. This is the Dunning-Kruger Dunning. So it's basically about how little we understand ourselves. And so the Dunning-Kruger effect, which itself is often miscited, was this finding that if you look at sort of the actual grades of students and sort of like plot them on a chart, and you sort of rank ordered them from like worst to best students, and then you look at how confident they were, the confidence is a flatter slope than the actual grade. So it suggests that people who were scoring the worst were overconfident, and the people who scored the very best were actually slightly underconfident. And Dunning sort of argues that this effect, and part of the effect may be just a compression of, like, when you ask people how well they do, they tend to go a little bit more middling answers than extremes. But Dunning's theory was that the reason that we cannot have this kind of self-insight, like we don't know when we're bad at something, is that the knowledge needed to self-assess is itself the knowledge we're missing. And I think that this is broadly true, that the reason that we often have poor understanding of our understanding, like, for instance, the person who's read one book and thinks they're an expert on something, they don't have enough knowledge to know what all the knowledge they're missing, right? And so I think that's one reason that we frequently stumble into that trap. Dumas, Count of Monte Cristo, and The Three Musketeers. Count of Monte Cristo is probably my favorite book. I've read it about, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 times. This is in French. I got this this is the best edition I could find in a nice big Paris bookstore.
What do you
Count
like
of
about
Monte
it?
Cristo. It's a great book. It's a little bit too heavy to read. It's like one of those ones that's nice to look at where you're actually holding it and you feel like you're holding a dictionary. But it's got little illustrations in it as well. But
What do you like about it?
it's just a great story. I don't know. I kind of, at this age, I'm sort of aware that it's maybe not like I don't think it's as the finest literature in the way that maybe I would have thought it is a classic, but it's just a very entertaining story. It's a story about, it's a story about, well, revenge, obviously, but also I would say redemption. It's a story about, as someone who's an atheist, it's also a story about kind of like religion and, divine justice and some of these things as well, which I think, mercy and grace and some of those things. So I don't know. It's an enjoyable story, and it's also this like fun portrait of sort of Napoleon era French society. Very entertaining. I don't know. It's a great book. It's a long one, but if you think of it like episodes of a TV series, it's great. Yeah, this is a dietitian book. I read it for the foundations one. It's very good. I find that there's like, I lean more towards the academic sort of nutritional science. Like, I want to see the meta-analyses. I want to see the like studies where they came up with these guidelines, whereas this book is basically just like expounding the guidelines themselves in quite a bit of depth. But if you were more interested in like, how should I eat, and not like, why do scientists think that, then this is like probably as thorough a book as you can get. I was joking. I was calling it my phone book when I was doing the reading for that month, because like, my God, it is a huge book. It covers
Maybe you should
everything.
say a few words about the Foundations project.
Oh yeah, sure. So this was about a year ago. I did a project where every single month I picked a different foundation for life. So I'm calling it a foundation when it is a sort of practice or habit or set of skills that is universally good for life. So for instance, you know, we all benefit from exercise. So one of the months was fitness, and I established a daily exercising habit, and I read a bunch of books about fitness and getting in shape. And then I had a month on healthy eating, and that book, and I had a month on personal finance, and I read some of the money books. So some of these books are going to be from there, but I did not keep all of the books from that process. Definitely some of them got purged, especially if I felt like I could repurchase them. Oh, there we go. We're now on to F. Or no, we're at E still. Is this E? I guess E and F, maybe. They're together. Drawing on the right side of the brain. Great book if you're looking to draw. The whole neuroscience is totally bonk, but it's a really good book if you want to learn to draw and you feel like you can't draw. So highly recommended to anyone, even though take the left brain, right brain with a real grain of salt. Differential equations, that would have been an MIT challenge book, as is multivariable calculus. Oh, now we're in Aaronson, Towards a General Theory of Expertise. It's an edited volume. He's Aaronson's the expert on experts, right? So he's written a lot about that. It's hard for me to pin down what was in these exact books, especially because a lot of them were kind of edited volumes. But, you know, I was referring to them frequently when I wrote the last book. And Beyond Belief. So this is a galley, so that's why it looks weird. It says on sale. This is a galley that Miguel sent me of his book Beyond Belief, which is an interesting, good book on beliefs. I think I don't 100% agree with y'all on everything in the book, but I don't 100% agree with pretty much anyone on anything, so that's not necessarily a critique. But I think Nirial and I have like similar penchant for like, we like to spend a lot of time doing the research to then try to summarize the research. And so I appreciate that about him, that we have a kind of similar way of approaching things. And this book is, it's at like, there's studies in there that like, I'm definitely going to cite them and bring them into my own writing. It's like, oh, that's fascinating. The Feynman lectures, these are great. So I don't recall the actual provenance of this, but I believe these were lectures that he gave in person that were like transcribed, I think. I don't think it was that he wrote this as a book. And if you've never seen like a Feynman do a lecture on physics, like look it up on YouTube, because I mean, he's just my intellectual hero. He is the best explainer of things of all time. And then following that, we've got his biography or autobiography, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, which is another classic. This, by the way, is where the Feynman technique comes from. there's like, so the Feynman technique was me in like 2010. I was doing this thing where I was like doing this sort of self-explanation approach. I don't know where I came up with it. So I don't want to like get too much credit for it, because there was a lot of ideas that predate it, like the 5-year-old method and some of these other ideas of self-explanation, and even in like the academic research, like Micheline Cheer's work on self-explanations. And so it's definitely not like my idea, but I did this video and I wanted to give it a name because I felt like, oh, well, it needs some hook for it. And I'd read Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, and he has this whole section where he's trying to understand the Yang-Mills paper about, now I don't remember what the paper was. It was something about weak nuclear force or something. And he kind of relates, oh, I don't understand this. And then he read through it very closely and he understood it in the book. But I kind of like, it was one of those fuzzy memory things. I'm like, well, he sort of did something like this. And then I coined this. And that was a huge mistake. So this is one of my big oh-no's that I did, is that I have like birthed this technique that has like questionable heritage. And Feynman did not actually do this exact thing. And I'm very guilty of that sin of like, I've learned my lesson from there that like if you're gonna say this is the Einstein technique or this kind of thing, you better be pretty confident that he did that exact thing because people are not going to like go back to my original video and like, you know, appreciate these nuances of telling the source. And nowadays people don't even realize that that my video is the sort of patient zero for that particular meme. And so, you know, you go online and you search the Feynman technique and, you know, I've had people ask me what I think about the Feynman technique, not realizing that I am the person who started that thing. So, yeah, anyways, what are you going to do? Human Performance, Fits and Posner. That's an older book about learning and improvement. It's got some stuff that's worth citing there. You got some textbooks by French on vibration waves and quantum physics. I did a month-long learning quantum physics project. I think an introduction to quantum physics was the textbook I used. And man, is that title faded. Now, they don't make books well, do they? That was bright red when I
Wow.
got that book. Yeah, a fuller an introduction to literary Chinese is another one of these IOU books. I think I did like 2 chapters of it. And I really have this dream that one day I'm going to like go through it all and learn like kind of classical Chinese. But it was yeah, it was one of those recommended books, but it's definitely there's some aspirational content here where I have not done it, but I'd like to one day. All right, what do we have here? Getner, The Idea Factory, Bell Labs. Oh, great book. I listened to it on Audible. So this is actually like I bought the book because I needed to reference it, but I actually listened to it on Audible rather than reading it in paper. Great story though. Bell Labs, just fascinating. The Creative Vision. Okay, so Csikszentmihalyi. So we were talking about Csikszentmihalyi's book Flow. So this is his book. This is like one of these books that you can't actually get because it's like out of print. But they looked at artists and they're sort of looking at their thesis was that being a great artist is about problem finding, not problem solving. And there's an interesting little academic side debate about whether those two are actually different things. But it's an interesting book. And I think it was also interesting because of some of the like hard realities of like finding that like even of the successful artists, they weren't all that successful. So it's also a little bit dispiriting. Like it's not the book to read if you wanted to become an artist.
I was
East
recently
is
teaching
yeah,
a
sorry.
module on Paul Erdős, and I
Oh
guess
yeah.
he's known as like the most prolific um,
Yeah.
mathematician of all time, and done all these collaborations and
Hmm.
like lived out of a suitcase. And he was known for being like a very good problem poser. Um, and I thought that was a really interesting kind of way of thinking about problem solving, problem
Yeah.
kind of generation or problematizing things.
Well, I think the way you can view it is that to have a problem, you have to first scope down what you're doing quite a bit. And so there's a sense of like, how do you find a good problem to work on is a very important issue in learning. So now there was a question, the sort of academic side debate was between Csikszentmihalyi and Herbert Simon, sort of the foundation of like sort of this cognitive approach to AI. Simon, who we'll get to his book because I think it's under N for Newell for human problem solving. He was very much this like problem solving theory of everything kind of guy. This is how thinking worked, and he argued that these aren't really different things. That you know, finding a problem to solve is itself a kind of problem. It's just like a less well specified one. Which I think is probably true, but I think, you know, it's sometimes distinctions are useful even if they are subspecies of the same general process. East is a Big Bird is a book that I did not read, but was so interesting that I didn't throw it out when I got there. But it's basically about people in Polynesia who have do wayfinding. So like how they find islands, because I don't know, it's kind of something you don't really think about because we got like GPS and navigation and this kind of stuff. But these people are on essentially canoes, and the islands are beyond the horizon. So you're paddling out into the open ocean, and this is the Pacific. Like this is they're far apart, right? And you're paddling in the open ocean, and there's maybe a tiny island that's the only land for, you know, thousands of miles. So if you slightly get the direction wrong, you're dead. Like there's no way you're ever finding land again, right? And this is just sort of talking about the mnemonic and cognitive tools that they used for basically kind of using star celestial positioning with this kind of like myth making and whatever to chart these progress. So it was the kind of thing that I was like, this is just fascinating. I'd like to include it in a book somewhere, this kind of thing, but it just never made the cuts. I never got to read it, but I look forward to one day. Learning and Memory, another textbook. I got lots of textbooks about cognitive science. I don't know whether there's anything particularly special about this one, but I did read it all. Goethe, always good. I think this is only the first part of Faust. I've got to read the second part at some point. But I don't know. You can see I definitely lean towards science and nonfiction. I don't have quite nearly as much literature, which is a definite weak point in my own library reading. My wife is reading a lot of classic literature right now, and it's making me feel a little bit of personal guilt. But I always feel like I'm compelled to, like, I'm reading because of some project. And so I very rarely feel like I have the spare capacity to be like, oh, I'm just gonna, read the collected works of William Shakespeare or Goethe
What's your
or
project
Moliere
right
or
now?
something. Well, right now we're doing a course called Everyday Energy, which is about the kind of the psychology of fatigue, what energizes us, motivation. And so I've still got a bunch of books and ideas that I'm reading there. I've got a book at home. It's not in this bookshelf, which is like this edited volume about like the meaning of life and the psychology of the meaning of life. It's like this big. It's like huge. And I'm not sure whether I'm going to finish it because I started reading the first few chapters and I'm like, this is pretty squishy. I don't really like to see science.
But it is kind of funny. I've been thinking about that, like how the connection between religion, spirituality, and motivation is
Mm,
sort of this core engine of productivity
yeah.
that is sort of a gateway to those very big questions.
Well, meaning of life, I mean, I don't know, just to sort of go on that tangent for a second there. I think uh there is this sort of existentialist tradition in the kind of secular work. So you think about like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning is kind of the classic of that field, but existentialism was this sort of philosophical movement. You can trace it to like Heidegger, Sartre, a lot of these people, they're sort of, writing in and around the sort of interwar period, World War II. And there was this sort of secular crisis of meaning of like, you're looking around you and the world's gone totally insane. And how do you derive meaning? And it seems like a lot of the old order doesn't work anymore. And how do you derive meaning from it? I tend to think, I don't know, the best book I've read on that, I would say, is actually a hypertext book, David Chapman's Meaningness. And I think he doesn't really give the answer. I don't know, that's my feeling. He doesn't really give the answer, but I think he kind of dispels some misconceptions. And I think one of the misconceptions is that there is a meaning to life, or is it the meaning of your life, or a purpose for your life, rather than meanings, plural. And that meaning is this sort of like interactive property of like you and the environment. And that, there are things that kind of have this continuum of meanings. So things have more meaning and less meaning, but maybe not ultimate meanings. And so I can't really explain the whole book, but if you're interested in that, you should read it because it's free and it's online.
Yeah, it
And
sounds
he's
cool.
probably added a bunch to it because he's constantly adding stubs to it. So it's probably a different book than when I read it initially.
We should maybe
Um,
explain just what a hyper book, would you say
Oh, yeah, so
hypertext book?
hypertext book is just basically like a Wikipedia is like that. It's just a
Yeah.
bunch of links. So it has like a content, but then there's a bunch of like where he defines a term and then there's a link to that. And so it's a fun reading experience. But he does a good job. I like David Chapman. He's the one who got me on Dreyfus and Heidegger and Philip Agre and like, so you have these people that you like their work and then you end up reading all of their sources. Gombrich, Art and Illusion. You see how it's tilted here. That's because a big book is missing because my wife was interested and took it. But his book, The Story of Art, which is that big gap that's not there, is a great book. And then Art and Illusion is also good. Good to have a little bit of art history. I think it's something that's really good to have before you go to the museum. I think so often you go to an art museum and you see these great works of art, and because you don't have any context, you don't have any like background, you can't really appreciate them. I think the way that you like, oh yeah, that's pretty or that's not pretty, or like you spend 2 seconds looking at it. Um, I think if you have some sense of the background in which these paintings emerged and what were the trends, the tendencies of the time, you notice a lot more, especially with some of the more recent trends where the art is like kind of maybe less aesthetically pleasing and more cognitively difficult. Good Cell, The Machinery of Life. This is a great book. I think everyone should have. It is this illustrated. You know what? Maybe I can show it on the camera
Yeah.
here. So he did these like beautiful like watercolors of like what like the cell looks like. Let me see if I can find it. Some of them are 3D graphics, so they're not all, but a lot of them are watercolors. So like this is like this is what they look like inside. So it's like him trying to be biologically accurate of like what does it actually look like. So this is like actin and myosin, like this is what your muscles look like on the inside. So It's a short book. It talks about cellular biology, and it's just beautiful, and it's just this book that everyone should have. How to read a paper. I got this one when I started reading Ultralearning because I was so anxious and scared that I didn't know how to do science, and I had to write this book. And so I remember reading this. It's more for people who are in medicine or like healthcare practitioners, but it has a lot of good heuristics for like how to think about, is this research any good or not? Hungry Brain, Stephen Guyenet. I did a podcast episode with him. This is a great book. Neuroscience of Overeating. And it's funny because it predates all this GLP-1 stuff. So I'd love it if he had an extra edition on that, because he does not talk about GLP-1, which is like everything around weight loss revolves around right now. But it is essentially this story, which is that we overeat because our brains are designed that way, and that there's all these unconscious forces that shape our eating behavior.
What's
Where are we now?
what's going on with this book stop here?
Oh, well, I think the books were falling down, so I put it there.
It looks like some kind of mathematical like
No, it's not. I think
circle
my wife
thing.
picked it up. My wife is more better interior design sense than I is. So I think when we were in the old office, I think we went to like one of these fancy boutique places and like bought a few things like this just to make it a little bit more aesthetically pleasing as a backdrop. Yeah. I gotta fill these books up a little bit. They're tilting. What do we have here? Hare, the Neuroscience of Intelligence. Hare's a kind of interesting guy. He's a little bit controversial, but this is like one of those Cambridge books where they get like the world's expert on X and get them to write a book about this. So this is all about intelligence as it applies to neuroscience. But Hare is like, I would say, strongly in the intelligence is mostly genetically determined camp. And he provides a lot of evidence of that. And like he argues that the heritability of intelligence is actually underestimated, because like when we do intelligence tests, we're often tapping like acquired knowledge. Whereas if you look at the G factor, which is this sort of like the common thing to all tests, that seems to be even more heritable. And he talks a lot about the mechanisms. It's like prefrontal cortex and some memory systems. I don't remember all the details, but I read it several years ago. Visible Learning, John Haidy. Okay, this is a book that if you're in education, you've probably read, because it's like the meta-analysis of meta-analyses. So he did like looked at like 2,000 meta-analyses and reported all the effect sizes from education. I'm much less impressed with the book now, just because I know how bad a lot of the underlying research is. And also, I feel like sometimes you get a bad meta-analysis, and then that kind of, it's a little bit like scientific laundering, where like you have bad research, but then you smuggle it into a meta-analysis, and then like out comes a number which you don't interrogate. You just like, oh, the effect size is 0.35, but the underlying research that led to it is just BS. So I've become a little bit less enthused about it, but it was definitely something that like when I was doing Ultralearning, I used as a guidepost, because it was like, well, what has the effect sizes? And some of it is accurate, like definitely stuff on practice testing and distributed practice and these kinds of things. I think the research is correct, but there's weird stuff in there too. Like I know he does one thing about like the effect of there's one area where like I know the meta-analysis that he's citing, and he reports a positive effect, but when you actually read the meta-analysis, the authors are like, yeah, but when you control for quality, it goes away, and like basically saying that the research done in this literature is bad. And so it's one of those things where I think it's a great book, but I would not use, he has a new one which adds way more meta-analyses, and I feel like the quality is even lower for a lot of them, because there's a lot of them where you're like, I don't know, I just don't trust them. So that's my bias right there. But it's a good book, I think, to read. But I would say, if you want to know for sure, read the underlying research and don't just like look at the number. Gödel, Escher, Bach, great book. I did a book club for this once. Basic idea is that he's interested in these recursive self loops. So Gödel, Escher, and Bach all have these qualities. Bach has these sort of like melodies that kind of loop in on themselves, these fugues. MC Escher is the guy who does the staircase, is like forever ascending, and it's a visual illusion. And Gödel is the main focus of the book, is this mathematician, this logician, who proved that there are certain statements in arithmetic you can't prove. But he did this in this sort of like weird way where he like essentially made the statement, this sentence cannot be proved, into like part of math, and then like put it inside itself. So it's sort of like, this sort of reflexive thing. And his whole argument is that that's what consciousness is. So there you go. If you want to know more, read that book. I also read his book, I Am a Strange Loop. Maybe that'll show up in the digital thing, but that's good. Man, I don't even know that we're going to get to the digital thing. Look at how long it's taking me to go through all these books. I'm lingering too long. David Hockney, Secret Knowledge. This is his idea that the reason that the Renaissance happened in terms of painting was that like people like Da Vinci and stuff had access to cameras. Not like, photographic cameras, but these sort of like basic pinhole camera techniques. And it was this technological revolution that led to this, amazing increase in realism, was that all of a sudden you had this ability to like get a 3D form and put it in 2 dimensions. And, I don't know whether I've heard some critiques that it's like, maybe he overstates his case, but he provides a lot of evidence of basically from places where there are specific distortions from the kinds of lenses they would have had at the time that you can see in the artwork. That's like, that's clearly how they made it. And he's a painter, so that's a fun book. Cultural Literacy, E.D. Hirsch, another controversial book. He argues basically that education should go back to a lot more of memorizing basic facts, classic literature, basic knowledge. I think there's some truth to it. I think that there is a case that, this idea of, well, we don't want to teach kids what to think, we need to teach them how to think, is ignorant of a lot of cognitive science, that the what to think is how to think, and that those two things are not separate. But, and E.D. Hirsch, I think, gets, like, because he kind of fits into a little bit of this sort of more in the conservative direction for educational philosophy. So there's a lot of, oh, you're teaching all these old dead white men kind of critiques of his ideas. But it's a good book worth reading, even if it's not a thesis you don't always agree with. I wrote a blog post about it if you're don't want to read the whole book.
I wanted to
Cognitive
say something
Gadgets.
quickly about this
Oh, sure.
Secret Knowledge.
Yeah.
There's a documentary called Tim's, TIM''S, Vermeer, and it's a inventor, Tim Jennison, who noticed the sort of realism you were talking about with Vermeer's paintings, and then sort of had this theory that he was using this kind of mirror
Yeah.
camera system, and then recreated the scene and kind of shows you how it would have worked. So sort of a documentary treatment of this similar idea.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating theory. This book, Hayes, Cognitive Gadgets, I started reading, I did not finish, but I've heard from other people that it really influenced them, so maybe I should go pick it up later. But I think the theory of the book is basically that, like, a lot of what we think of as innate cognitive circuitry are themselves acquired. But I don't have a verdict on what I think of that idea. Joseph Henrich, The Secret of Our Success. I talk about this book all the time. Basically, he argues that the thing that separates us from great apes is not raw intelligence, but social learning, the ability to learn through culture. And that actually, if you compare young children who are not as encultured to various apes, they do worse on a lot of cognitive tests than apes do, but with the exception of social learning. If you show them how to do stuff, kids are really good at picking it up and apes are not. And so he makes a whole theory, grand theory of everything from this observation, but it's a good one. And he talks a lot about how, like, cultures embed wisdom through this sort of like trial and error adoption of best practices. What's this next one here? Skian? Is it Skian? What is it? The one after here? I can't quite see it here. Oh, no, this is, oh yeah, this is Swain. This is a second language acquisition book. I don't remember this one specifically. I read it like in a burst with a bunch of similar books, but I wrote a sort of summary of all these ones. Being in Time. Oh my God. Yeah. This book here is like very difficult to wrap your head around. I do not recommend reading it. If you're going to read it, read it alongside Hubert Dreyfus's exegesis on YouTube. So he has like it's kind of like a podcast that are like audio recordings of his class where he's like dissecting the book bit by bit. But yeah, Heidegger is like, I don't know, I'm just drawn to things that are weird, and he's so weird. I don't even know whether I agree with most of the stuff he says, but it's like, it's just such an alien way of looking at a lot of stuff, compared to my perspective, that I feel like there's some merit in that, even if I'm like, maybe some of this is just total nonsense, or most of it. Yeah, Einstein, Walter Isaacson biography. I actually bought this book recently, even though I read it a long time ago because I needed a physical copy. But Walter Isaacson is great. Read all his books. Michael Huemer, Problem of Political Authority. He's a very famous libertarian philosopher, and he makes the case in this book that like basically even democratic government is unethical. I don't know whether I agree with him, but he has some interesting arguments. Cambridge Handbook of Thinking and Reasoning. So I have a few of these kinds of books, which this one I actually read cover to cover, which I don't think it's intended for you to do that, but it's basically like they get experts on specific subtopics and get them to write a chapter. So it's really great if you want to like survey a wide set of literatures and just be like, what do people think about this? And then they have like a whole chapter on that. So I don't remember all the specific topics, but Keith Hollyoak, I've cited a lot of his research in Get Better at Anything. So he was one of the editors. What do we have here? William James. Yeah. Principles of Psychology, William James. I don't know. There's like a little bit of I would say almost a rule in psychology that any single idea you can have, William James actually had it first. So William James was basically the first psychologist. And he wrote this Principles of Psychology, and he literally talks about everything. And like it prefigures so much stuff. So it's hard to find stuff where he wasn't writing about it first, but very much from this kind of like pre-scientific, often just like leaning on like, this is what I think from introspection, but write about a lot of stuff too. So Johnson-Laird, mental models. So mental models get bandied around a lot, but Johnson-Laird's theory of mental models is quite specific. It's basically that when we reason about things, we kind of construct little simulations in our head, and these simulations have very specific kind of forms, and we inspect those things, and we are able to like inspect them and see what's true about those little like diagrams basically we set up in our head. And that this is both how we have incredible powers of reasoning and the source of most of our reasoning mistakes, is that this is the way that we do our reasoning, which is in contrast with how like logicians do reasoning, which is through theorem proving, which is a very different way of doing it. And so it leads to totally different kinds of intuitions and also failure modes and stuff. But great book. He has a newer book called How We Reason. So this is the 1983 book that he wrote, which is sort of like early in his research. But How We Reason is like his, I think, in the late 2000 aughts book that kind of summarizes a lot of research since then. So if you're going to read a book, read that one, I think, because it's the more recent one. Thinking Fast and Slow, classic. That's a good example of a book where like it's actually like written by the expert in the field, and it's a good thought-provoking book, but was also a bestseller. Very rare combination, but I recommend it to people. Even though Kahneman, I would say that you'd have to retract a lot of the stuff he writes about priming, but I don't think that was Kahneman's fault. That was sort of the understanding of the field at the time. But all of his actual research, where he's talking about like, originally talking about, like I mentioned, his book Attention and Effort, some of his work on prospect theory, happiness. It's a great book.
What changed in terms of priming?
Well, basically the whole priming field collapsed in the replication crisis. So just to be clear, so what do I mean by that? So priming has a broader connotation. It's basically, priming is when you give someone information, often maybe subliminally. So you only flash it on a screen with a mask for like maybe 100 milliseconds. So it's actually too short to cognitively register. So you don't, if you ask people what they saw, they don't see anything, right? But what happens is that this very brief exposure to a visual stimulus does process up some of the layers of the sort of visual cortex in our neural net. So it has this biasing effect on some downstream behavior, even though it doesn't go far enough downstream to activate this sort of conscious recognition loop. And so there was all this research suggesting that you could prime people subconsciously and have these large effects on behavior. So it had all these like cutesy studies like, oh, if you use old words like old and haggard and this kind of stuff, and then you measure how fast they walk out of the experiment's laboratory, they like slow down their walking speed. And it was like real, like, I would say, you know, scientific headline clickbait type stuff with these sensationalist kind of findings. And it doesn't mean the entire idea of priming is wrong, because it's still valid research, but a lot of that social priming was shown to be kind of artifactual and, you know, replication crisis. This was, you know, you can't replicate these findings, or they're too strong, or, you know, read Andrew Gelman's blog and he'll tell you why all that stuff was BS. So he cites a lot of this stuff because this is pre that reckoning, as this kind of thinking fast system. Like, he cites some of this research, but it's not actually his research. And I don't want to fault him too much, because if you find people who wrote books of that era, they also believed this research. So it seems to be something that, like, a lot of people who were in the field just took for granted, that this was established science, and that the replication crisis of like, oh, even though there's been millions of studies on this, it's not actually valid, had not happened yet. Knagle, Apprentice to Genius. This is about the Johns Hopkins research dynasty. I think, you know, I think this made it into Get Better at Anything in like a few like side notes, but it was just fascinating. And this book, along with the book, which I don't know whether we're going to get to because it's Zed, but Zuckerman's book, Scientific Elite, I think is the name of the book. Yeah, Scientific Elite. Those books are really about how much elite science is essentially an apprenticeship, that it is not something you learn through book knowledge, but you learn through sort of at the hands of the master, and through all this tacit knowledge and all this stuff that both makes it less amenable, I think, to the kind of LLMification of science that we're sort of witnessing right now, that I think that that's a major obstacle, but also makes it this incredibly kind of elitist institution where, you know, science is like one of the least egalitarian fields because of this effect, that like essentially you need to be studying under the right people to make a contribution. And if you're not, you're not. So it's a little bit disappointing if you're in some kind of intellectual backwater, or you're like me and you're completely outside of the academy. I can basically give up any chance of making a Nobel Prize winning discovery, which I'm okay with. Kant, Critique of Pure Reason. I have not read this. I kept it in part because this book is funny, because my my brother-in-law is a philosophy master, and he's a real like really passionate about philosophy. He actually bought this book for my son when he turned 1. Like, I was like, oh, only he would buy this book, though. Like, this is for your first birthday, Critique of Pure Reason. And I don't think he was being sarcastic about it. But I don't know. Maybe my son Thomas will read it at some point. Maybe I'll read it at some point, but not right now. Kinch, Comprehension. Walter Kinch is the sort of expert on reading comprehension. So how do we understand what we read from a text? And he has a great theory there that I would say, it's a cognitive theory, so it's still sort of in that symbol manipulation tradition, but I would say that it draws more on this, more on theories that you could recognize as being a little bit more about neuroscience, and this idea of like kind of like spreading activation of weights and stuff. But it's a really interesting theory, because he kind of argues that we are never just reading the literal text. We're always importing our background knowledge to fill in gaps of understanding and make that picture. And so that explains in some cases why you know, people who seem really smart are able to read hard books much more easily, because they have all this background knowledge, so that they're never just reading the text, they're also reading the library that's in their head. And if you don't have that library, it can be very hard to read it. How Learning Happens, Kirchner and Henrik. Kirchner was one of the people, I think, who really turned me on to the direct instruction model of education, and he's a great researcher, and he has a lot of stuff. And this How Learning Happens is, I think it's like maybe 10 or 15 papers they discuss that are like sort of central papers in educational psychology. But Kirchner has a great blog called 3-Star Learning, and he's very critical, I think, of a lot of the like, I would say somewhat less scientifically robust trends in education, and especially educational teacher training and that kind of thing. Clark, he did a lot of, so he's sort of in the same vein as Anderson and these cognitive systems guys, Simon. This exploring science is that he has this kind of like model of how people do science, where it's this dual problem space of like creating theories and then creating experiments to test the theories, and you're kind of going back and forth and arguing that this is how science works. And he's done some like simulations where they do like how you simulate this sort of science solving process. Interesting book. And this is my Macedonian textbook. This is another one that I illegally printed from Lulu Press because I could not buy it. I got a PDF of it. But this is like, if you're learning Macedonian, which I don't know why you would be, but if there's one person, whoever listens is learning Macedonian, this is like the only textbook there is on that. So I used that a lot when I was doing my Macedonian project. Still use it a little bit. Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I mean, it's a like this is the book that introduced the idea of paradigms, so it's worth reading for that reason alone. I don't like swallow wholesale the Kuhnian kind of like it's all relative and there's no way of adjudicating between paradigms, but I do think his idea of paradigmatic change being the way that science progresses. I mean, as I was saying before, you follow the history of psychology and it's like, it's not that behaviorism was proven false. It's just that the ideas of behaviorism are like just not the way you frame ideas in the current paradigm. And maybe when we get deep into this neuroscience paradigm, which has been emerging, the stuff of Simon and other people who are like old-fashioned cognitive psychologists, it's just going to be forgotten because it's not written in the paradigm of the current understanding, which is all fMRI data and stuff like that. Where are we here? Lakoff. Oh, I love this book because of the title, Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. Isn't that a great title? This book is based on an indigenous language that has different gender categories. So, like French has masculine and feminine, and German has masculine and feminine and neuter, and it's common in European languages. Well, it turns out in other indigenous languages and other languages around the world, they don't always have this category system by gender in the way that we ascribe male female. They have sometimes 5 categories or 6 categories, and it affects the grammar of how you talk about things. And this one language, I don't know the name of the language, one of the categories is women, fire, and dangerous things. So those things you have to use a certain kind of like, I don't know, maybe it's you end it with a certain letter or something. I don't know how they handle that gender in the language. But this book is not about that. This book is about categories and how do we form categories, and George Lakoff's idea that the sort of classical view of category, where it's defined by necessary and sufficient conditions. So you sort of say like, these are the rules for belonging in the category of bird, for instance, is like it must be X, Y, or Z. That's not actually how categories work, cognitively speaking. The categories are defined, even categories that have very rigid boundaries, so that we know they're 100% birds or 100% not birds. They're not fuzzy. Mentally speaking, are organized in terms of prototypes. So a prototype is a kind of like the most bird-like bird. So if you think about bird, the prototype would probably be like a robin. And an ostrich is a bird, but it's not a prototypical bird. And it shows up in all these sorts of effects. And so this is another book where like using this idea of how do people form categories to influence the mind. And then he also makes this philosophical argument that the way we think of the sort of like philosophically naive view of categories as necessary and sufficient conditions, those kinds of categories don't actually exist. So yeah, I think he uses the example of like zebras or giraffes or this kind of stuff. Like there's no way biologically to like fence in the concept of zebra in the way that we want, with this idea of like, well, it has to be this like, species, or, there's no way to do that. So it's interesting. Yeah. And the prototype theory is also obviously involved in cognitive science. Laboratory Life, Latour, and Latour is like, he's also like, I don't know, I kind of put him in the Heidegger camp, and he's like a little bit of this continental philosopher type. They just have these like wild theories that you're like, oh, is that total nonsense? But also like, did I just change my whole way of thinking about this? So Laboratory Life is Latour and Woolgar did this kind of anthropological work where they were looking at people in a biological laboratory who are on the sort of the process of them making a scientific discovery. And he basically has this whole argument about how science is this sociological process and facts are things that we create through this sociological process, and that cognitive explanations of science like Clark and some of these other people that I said, these are really overrated, that what's actually happening is this sort of negotiation between different individuals and their social relationships are defining what becomes facts. I think that's a little overstated, but I do think, this sociological or anthropological perspective on science is obviously important because science is done by people. It's not, it's not a theorem proving process. And these arguments and this sort of what makes something a fact and the process of becoming a fact, these things are important for understanding how that process actually works. Lave and Wegner, situated learning. This is very much, this is one of my first do the real thing research readings. She sort of argues that school learning doesn't work because a lot of what we learn is situated in particular contexts and environments. So she has this sort of anti-cognitive perspective on a lot of things. I think she's wrong about a lot of stuff, but in a way that she is at least stimulating. And she does a lot of like, again, also anthropological work where she was like going into like factories and seeing how people actually did addition that they needed for the job, and it often wasn't like the school book algorithms that they would have learned. So it's interesting. It kind of shows that like the way people actually cope with their environment is often not the way that we teach them things. And so they have some good examples. And she's sort of arguing in favor of apprenticeship as a way of learning. I think there's some value in what she's talking about, but I don't think theoretically it's the way I view the world. Machiavelli, The Prince. I mean, this is like the book that set off the scientific revolution in some ways. This is like one of the first thinkers of that kind of era. He's the guy who comes up with the term fact, I think, effective action, like things that make something true. And he's, I don't know, he's an interesting guy. Like, I think we associate him with this particularly amoral way of thinking at the time. But I think it's also important to think about like what the context was that he was learning, and that he's like, he's living in, is it Florence he was living in? I'm embarrassing myself. I don't forget what city he was living in, but he was like kind of on exile. He was in exile because, and he's writing this book to the people who are in charge right now because he's like hoping to get back in their good graces and stuff. And so, but I think it's a very good book to talk about. Like he's the sort of originator of this more kind of realpolitik idea. So I don't know. I don't know how much I have to say about the Prince that you probably couldn't learn better elsewhere. Marotrana and Varela, The Tree of Knowledge. I don't know. This book is a weird one. It is sort of also in this kind of more, like they sort of make this case about, the way knowledge works. It's a little bit more in this kind of Buddhist Eastern philosophy kind of perspective. It's one of those ones that I think I'd have to reread to know what I feel about it, because when I was reading it at the time, I was like, oh, this is interesting. But now I feel like my thinking has shifted more in the other direction. So I'd have to like reread it to know whether I even liked what I liked about it. Meyer, Learning and Instruction. Richard Meyer's great educational psychologist. I spoke to him when I was doing Get Better at Anything. He gave me some good advice, told me to read some of the Gestalt psychologists, and he's a great guy. And this is his textbook, and he talks a lot about what we know about learning and psychology, and I respect him. Parallel distributed processing. So if you want to know what the sort of origin of deep learning is, it's these books. This is the sort of beginning of like this neural approach to understanding like cognition and stuff. And at the time, I would say it was a very marginalized view, and now it's becoming more and more accepted. Four Disciplines of Execution. I kind of don't like the title of this book, but it's a great book of a self-help book of the kind of Stephen Covey flair. I think it's his son, Sean Covey, who was one of the authors. But they basically argue in favor of setting singular goals that you sort of organize your organization around accomplishing. And so sort of talking about like, how do you actually get things done? Like not how do you make decisions, but how do you actually implement the things that you want? And so I like that book. I recommend it to people. Neuroscience of Sleep and Dreams is one of the ones I read for the sleep month. It's very interesting. Sleep is one of those things that we don't think about that often, right? Because we're unconscious, but it's actually extremely mysterious and complicated. All the like brain stuff that's going on when you're asleep. So it's a good book to read. 10 Steps to Complex Learning. So Marenbohr and Kirchner, I mentioned Kirchner before because he wrote that other paper, but Marenbohr and Kirchner, they are two cognitive science educational psychologists that I really respect. And this 10 Steps to Complex Learning is their like practitioner's guide. So like, how can you construct curricula that fit what they think is a good way to learn? So it's more in the direct instruction realm, but I would say that they sort of go beyond it, because direct instruction I think is more relevant for like simple skill learning, like when you need to learn something like learning to read or arithmetic or basic stuff. Whereas they deal with the fact that, you know, often problem solving, you need to have mental models, you need to have various kinds of things, but they integrate a huge amount of cognitive psychology, educational psychology in this approach. So if someone's like looking like what's a good way to teach some difficult skill, I recommend this book. Now, I can't say his last name, Miodownik. Mark Miodownik, Stuff Matters. This is a fun, popular book about material science. I love books where it's just like, I've never thought about material science before. And he has like, I think it's organized into chapters where like each chapter is something, like some unusual material property. So like, I think one of them is concrete and one of them is chocolate. And like the thing I remember about chocolate is that like chocolate, the thing that's interesting about it is that it has different crystal formations. And so that's why when you get chocolate, it's hard. But then if you melt it and rethaw it, like, or like reharden it under room temperature, it's not as hard as it was before. It's because you have to use the specific crystal structure of chocolate, which they do by putting seed crystals in the chocolate in the factory. And so if you melt it and break that crystal structure, it forms a different crystal structure. Anyways, this Stuff Matters is like an example of a kind of book that I love where it's about some topic that I've never thought of before, but it's well written and entertaining. Another book, which I think I just have it on Kindle, so we may not get to it, but is Entangled Life by Merlin Shannon-Drake, which is about fungus. And I've told people, oh yeah, this is a great book I read about fungus. And they look at me like I'm absolutely insane. And I think they're the ones who are crazy. I think you should read more books about fungus. You should read books about stuff that you've never thought of before, because those books stick with you and they're interesting and they change your life. This is a textbook on relationships. Lots of interesting findings there. Like, yeah, just things like some of the stuff is contrary to like popular wisdom. So like, for instance, one of the things that I got from this book was that people, we have this sort of stereotype that like, you know, maybe from kind of more conservative angles, that like relationships are better when the men are men and the women are women, kind of, you know, oh, and all this, you know, androgynous stuff. This is what's ruining our relationships these days. You know, get some kind of conservative, grouchy kind of viewpoint. And because the research actually shows the opposite, that relationships do better when men kind of have a higher level of emotional intelligence and this sort of femininity, and when the women have this sort of more score highly in some of the more stereotypically masculine or instrumental kind of rational traits, and that those tend to be healthier relationships than the sort of ones with more strongly traditional gender roles, which I thought was interesting.
And it looks like the author for this is Roland S. Miller and Daniel Carlin.
Yeah, sorry. I buy these books and they're old and they put these awful little like barcodes on the tag that you can't scrape off. So that's unfortunate, but Mukherjee, The Emperor of All Maladies. Mukherjee has a lot of good books. I don't know whether maybe I got rid of his other book. I don't know. There's a lot of books that got lost in the purge, but he also has a good book on genes. And The Emperor of All Maladies I really liked because he is a doctor and it is about the history of cancer, and just all the stuff that goes into it. So, I mean, you know, obviously a little bit of a heavy subject, but I mean, it taught me so much. So, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. So, what more sales pitch do you need?
Yeah, it's funny, and I've been seeing this book in particular on a lot of bookshelves lately. From a
The
lot of
Emperor of All
different.
Maladies.
Yeah, I've been kind of
Yeah, it's
surprised.
great. It's a good
Yeah.
book. Yeah. There's Van Gogh, The Life. This book was very long. I read it because I covered Van Gogh in Ultralearning, and this was my source material. And I feel like you read 900 pages of Van Gogh's life and you like him less and less with each page. he must have been a really insufferable person, and that's why nobody liked him at the time.
What did you cover about him? I don't remember from the paper.
Just that he, well, I think, I don't know which chapter is he in. Is he in experimentation? I'm trying to think now. But he did a lot of like, well, one thing I did cover about him, I'm trying to reflect on what I covered about him in the book. I do remember he did a lot of like, he did a lot of like repetitive practice. So there's this painting called The Sower that he did like dozens of times. And he, those like sunflowers in the vase, he did dozens of times. And he's someone who, like, I love his art. I love his art, but when you read about him as a person, you're like, oh my God, like I can see why only your brother could stand you. Just kind of an insufferable guy. Yes, this is Nakamura. This is a Japanese scholar called The Ways of Thinking of Eastern Peoples. I think the title's a little overstated. I would say this is the ways of thinking of particular ancient philosophers in different countries in Tibet, Japan, India, and China. I have not finished this book. I've only gotten, I think, to End of China. So I don't know how the Tibetan or Japanese people think. But of the Indian and Chinese, what I can say is that the Indians love abstraction, and they love they're sort of like, basically they're the culture ideally suited for mathematics, according to him, because they like abstract things. They like these stories. They like principles and concepts and numbers. And they're not good at history. That's what his argument is that they like blend history and myth together, and they're very loosey-goosey with a lot of details. In contrast, the Chinese people are like kind of overly concrete. They don't like abstract ideas. Even their philosophers like Lao Tzu and stuff prefer like, analogies and things. They don't like creating principles and stuff. They like concrete things, but that makes them very good at history. And you can see that Chinese people have incredibly detailed history. And so you can find like basically meeting notes from some imperial discussion that happened in like 200 BC. And it's like, oh, and so said this to so-and-so, and they study it that way. Now, I don't know whether this actually bears on the psychology of these people, but Nakamura seems to think that this affects how these people see the world and perceive it, that China is a much more historical society, and maybe India is a more philosophical in the way we would view in the West philosophical society. So it's interesting to think about. I don't know what he gets to when he gets to Japan and stuff, but I'd love to hear what the Chinese and Indian people think about it, because I'm sure they don't love the Japanese imperialist necessarily describing their things. But Nakamura is a scholar of some repute. And here's his other one. It's backwards, but A Comparative History of Ideas by Nakamura. And this one is, he's sort of making the case that there is this sort of like evolutionary transition that goes on in a lot of cultures at this time period. So he's making this case that like there was this similar transition that happened in ancient Greece and ancient India and ancient China, and that this deserves some explanation, which to me denies the obvious implication that, well, these places were linked through trade routes and land borders. So it's not like the Americas where they didn't have any plausible cultural influence on each other. So maybe it's less mysterious than it first seems. Ulrich Nasser, Cognition and Reality. This is again one of these sort of like critiques of the excesses of cognitivism books, where he's the one who references this East is a big bird, but he kind of argues that like a lot of these memory studies that people were doing don't really reflect how people use memory in real life. I think this is something that I was more interested in when I was doing the Do the Real Thing ideas, and now I feel like it's a weaker argument than it was initially. But Nasser, he was one of the people who kind of helped found cognitive science, so his critique does have some merit, but it's sort of about some of the excesses of some of the thinkers that now I don't think are quite as prominent. Cal Newport, So Good They Can't Ignore You. I have all his books. I mean, I met Cal Newport before he published So Good They Can't Ignore You. I met him in 2006. I was a freshman in college. I think he was doing his master's. We were both writing about learning. I think he had just published maybe How to Win at College. Maybe he had just published that one. I'd have to look at the dates to know whether he had also written and published How to Become a Straight A Student. But I mean, he's been one of my closest friends in this whole journey, and I really respect his work and admire his thinking. And I wish I could write books like him. And then I think we have some other Cal Newport books here. I've got digital Digital Minimalism, Deep Work, A World Without Email. A World Without Email is a really underrated book. It's exactly the book I love. He's like really leaning in on his computer science background and talking about the thing he's actually like a PhD expert in. I think it was disappointing that it didn't do as much as Slow Productivity or Deep Work or some of his other books, but that's one of my favorite of his. But I like all of his ideas. Human problem solving,
I was
Newell and
just going to say,
Simon.
with
Oh
slow
yeah, sure.
productivity, it does seem like this marks somewhat of a shift to this idea of slow life. And I was
Yeah.
just curious if you had thought about that at all, kind of in the
Well,
zeitgeist.
I don't, I think we don't agree on everything, but I feel like I think Cal has been very perceptive in noticing trends of our times and pushing back on the zeitgeist in a way that seems prescient later. So for instance, in Deep Work, he says like quit social media, which at the time seemed kind of curmudgeonly. I remember it. It was sort of like, oh, like, come on, like social media is good, right? And now I think pretty much everyone acknowledges that it has these, if it's not like universally bad, it at least has these strong drawbacks. Which wasn't apparent at the time he wrote it. So I think he's kind of writing against some of these ideas of being busy and trying to get tons of stuff done and not focusing on your deep work. I also think it's a shift in Cal's life stage. Like, I think you see So Good They Can't Ignore You. You see his raw ambition. You see that he's still trying to get tenure, that he's still trying to make a name for himself as an author. And now with Slow Productivity, I think he's achieved a lot of those goals. And you see him kind of like, how do I do deep, meaningful work? Um, Maybe less from that perspective of hunger and more from I'm this, somewhat public figure who has a lot of demands on my time and schedule and a lot of busyness if I wouldn't control it. And so I think you can see the evolution of Cal's thinking in part to reflect his life. Like I think he said before that the inspiration for deep work came from being in the like theory department of MIT and like seeing some of these researchers just like absorbed in some theorem proving for hours at a time and recognizing that like this is not how people work these days. So yeah, I don't know, but I have a lot of admiration for Cal Newport, and he's the kind of person that like every time I talk to him about things, I feel like he's seeing a few moves ahead in the sort of authorial landscape than I can certainly. Yeah, Newell and Simon, Human Problem Solving. This is like a classic text. The book is like, you don't actually have to read most of the book. It's like super thick, but a lot of it is like their data, which is unnecessary. But they basically make this model for how thinking works, which is that you define a problem space, you define sort of operators for moving in the problem space, and then it's this sort of heuristic search to find solutions. And so they study actual people solving problems, usually like little kind of like math puzzles or anagrams or chess moves or things like that. And then asking them to sort of like explain their thinking while they're thinking it, they kind of model it. So they have these huge transcripts of like how people try to solve these problems and they're coming up with a theory for it. But I would say that this human problem solving is like an important paradigm in the field, and that like it set the tone for a lot of learning and memory research that followed after it. And so like in my last book, Get Better at Anything, I have to make the first chapter about this book, even though there's kind of no practical consequence for it, really, because like all the other things I want to discuss kind of build on it, right? Like I want to talk about intuition, I want to talk about cognitive load theory, I want to talk about these other ideas. And you kind of have to already, like, you have to understand what problem solving is. You have to understand like what is this process of like defining a problem and searching a problem space, and what are the inherent kind of logical difficulties in doing that are not just and so it's a paradigm book, and I think it's valuable for that. The Design of Everyday Things, great book. I read this book is like from when I was in high school, I think. It's a great book. I don't know, I don't remember all of the book. One of my things I remember most is about like how do you design things so that they're just sort of intuitive to use. And one of his ideas is that light switches are badly designed. And once you think about it, you can't unsee it. But light switches are badly designed because you never know which switch controls which lights unless you try it, right? So when you go to a new place, there's always this like tinkering of like, where's the light for this? And he was arguing that, well, the way that you should do a light switch is that it should be some kind of like it should like sort of like correspond visually to which lights control which things. So it shouldn't be this sort of like panel that has just two switches, but it should be like maybe a panel that's matches the layout of the room, and so you could like press the buttons that correspond to that thing. So he has ideas like this, but it's also it's a classic book. Graham Nuthall, The Hidden Lives of Learners. So this is in I want to say Australia, but maybe it's New Zealand. No, I think it's New Zealand. But he spends time in classrooms and sort of looks at learning behavior in an actual classroom setting. So it's a little bit anthropological. But one of the things that I thought was interesting from this is that he finds, at least, I don't want to say this is a truism, but he finds at least that everyone learns at basically the same rate in his study. The difference is that the better students are having more exposures to the information. Like they're actually paying attention to the lecture and actually getting those exposures, which, maybe is true. I think that is something that's underrated, is that, we chalk things up to a lot of ability when often it's just like, are you actually paying attention to what's being learned? Like if you have interest and you're paying attention, learning a lot of things is a lot easier.
I had the experience in high school of like who was better at video games, and like you had a bunch of people playing the same video game, and it often seemed like there was kind of an interesting pattern where the people who are the best at the video game, which is sort of a, I don't know if it's a purely cognitive skill or what exactly it would be, but I guess there's some motor there, but um it seemed like it wasn't, you could have somebody who wasn't the best student or wasn't, you wouldn't think is the smartest, but was the best at that specific game. And it made
Yeah.
you think like, it was often the kid that was most obsessed with the game and put the most
Hmm.
time in. And it really made me think about like, are these students not performing well because, if they were as addicted to their schoolwork as they were to this video game, how much
Yeah.
different would the standings look in the class?
There's this great Daniel Willingham quote, and I think I only have his books digitally. I know there's a few that I have paper, but they're at my house. Um, but he has this great quote, that memory is the residue of thought, and I think that this is the right way to think about learning. That I don't know, I wish after reading all these books that there was some like super complicated theory of learning that like had all these shortcuts and stuff. That would definitely be good for my Like, it would definitely be good for my, like, brand of, like, selling courses and books and stuff. But a lot of what I've learned is basically that you learn what you pay attention to. And a lot of learning technique, a lot of method is just how do you pay attention to it? How do you, like, get yourself to pay attention to this thing? And I think, that's why this interest can be such a big factor, because if you're motivated to attend to the information, you are going to put it in your mind and it's going to become a part of memory. And that's such a huge part of the process. And so often when we don't learn things, it's because we're not paying attention to it. And and that's at a very kind of, it's not even like a super conscious process. So I don't know. It's hard to resolve as an issue, because if the issue is just that you're not motivated to attend to the thing that you need to learn, um, it, it's tricky. You have to like find some way to trick yourself into paying attention to it.
So this course you have
Um,
now on everyday motivation, is that,
yeah.
do you talk about that?
Not so much about attention. No, no, this one is more about like fatigue and how do you maintain your like energy levels. And so yeah, I could get into that. There's a whole separate discussion there, but it's a little bit about like how do you organize the work so that it requires less effort? How do you cultivate the kind of biological sources of energy? So things like exercise, good sleep, these kinds of habits. How do you find meaning in the work that you're doing so it's motivating? So it's related, but I don't think it's, if I were to write a course on learning, it would often be a lot of tactics of like, well, if you're doing technique X, then you have to pay attention to it. And so that's how it works. So like taking notes, for instance, is like, that's why taking notes works, because when you take notes, the orienting technique forces you to pay attention. So it's not that the note taking does anything in particular, but it's just keeping your mind focused on the topic,
Hmm.
which is valuable in lectures where your mind is apt to wander. Ohanian physics. Oh, so this was MIT challenge. This is a great textbook. Love this book. Ohanian physics. Yeah, I did. It had both electromagnetism and classic mechanics in here, and I think they go up to There's no quantum mechanics. I don't know whether there was something about strong forces in here too, but there was a bunch of stuff in this book that I did not cover. So it's a very thick book, but great sort of intro physics textbook. Deng Xiaoping is, I think the title of the book is called A Revolutionary Life. But yeah, I read this book. I don't know how I don't know why Deng Xiaoping, but he's certainly one of the most important figures in modern Chinese history, him and Mao. And he's sort of the person who set China on the path to its economic dominance that it is right now. And yeah, it's interesting, especially since Xi Jinping seems to be returning a little bit more to the Maoist doctrine. It'll be interesting to see how things turn out in the long run. But definitely Deng Xiaoping, like he's the one who opens up markets. He's the one, I would say, who's largely responsible for China's economic success. But he's also the same person who, was responsible for Tiananmen and the crackdown on democracy. So he's certainly an interesting figure. Microeconomics, this would have been an MIT challenge book when I did micro.
So do you keep these just for nostalgic purposes, or?
It's good to have. I think, yeah, I don't know. I don't know whether I would need the micro and macro textbooks, but I don't know. Yeah, I was doing the Marie Kondo, Does It Spark Joy? And like some of these books is like, I read them and I feel good about them. I don't know whether I would reference them that much. They are textbooks, but every once in a while I go back to things like that. So I don't know. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Persig. I don't know whether I agree with his philosophy at all. I think his philosophy is wrong, but it's a great book. Great little road trip discussion about philosophy, being, quality. I don't know. It's a great book. Tacit Dimension, Michael Polanyi. Polanyi is an interesting figure because he's a scientist, he's a chemist, but he also is this sort of quasi-continental philosopher who he argues, he very much is from the European continental tradition where he's not an analytic philosopher. He's like, talking about all sorts of inscrutable terms like residing in the thing and whatever. But this Tacit Dimension is a very short book where he talks about the idea of tacit knowledge. Personal knowledge is his more like his bigger work that really introduces the idea of tacit knowledge. But tacit knowledge is things that you know but cannot say. And he argues that this plays this central role in thinking and in particular in science, that you cannot break down science to rules because it depends on this kind of tacit intuition. Foundations of Cognitive Science, another edited volume. I also read this one cover to cover, but I could not tell you what was in it just because it's like very by its nature kind of generic introductory concepts to various subfields in cognitive science. Prack and Wallace, Apprenticeship in Early Modern Europe. Again, I was doing Do the Real Things. I was reading about apprenticeship. This is a very good, interesting history of the actual institution of apprenticeship and like all of its both successes and how it maybe contributed to some of the dominance of Europe, but also obviously all of its flaws. Like it was this sort of, monopolized guild system that has all these barriers to entry and monopolies on certain types of skilled work. And so it was sort of like partly training, but also sort of a little bit antagonistic towards education because a lot of times what the masters wanted from their apprentice was free labor. They didn't want to teach them the skill, so there was all this kind of agent principle problems of like, okay, well, I'm offering myself as free labor, but I am more valuable to you when I, can't leave you. And so it's just sort of showing some of the economic consequences of that model, which I would not suggest that we return to, but there are some advantages of it in some cases over our current model. And it still exists today, as we were talking about with Apprenticeship to Genius, the Knagle book. Spark, I added this one recently. I think I listened to it on Audible originally, but I was doing it for this. But John Rady is a doctor. He's written a lot about ADHD, but this book in particular is about how exercise is so valuable for mental health and cognition. And, if you're a sort of a more bookish person like I am, this is maybe the book to read to get you to go out running, because it's clear that exercise is probably one of the best investments you can make in your brain.
Did you have any thoughts on this the Proctor and Dutta?
Sorry, what did you say?
The skill
Oh, I
acquisition.
skipped it. Yeah. Sorry, Procter and Dudley. Yeah, that's a great textbook. Um, trying to think of what they do. This the skill acquisition curve. Yeah, I don't know. The problem is that I read so many of these textbooks on skills and learning and this kind of stuff that a lot of the ideas have blurred together. I'm trying to remember something specific that I cited from this particular textbook. But I definitely read it and it definitely informed my viewpoint. But it's like I've read too many now. They're like too many
Yeah.
like overlapping pictures. It's hard to
Becomes a blur.
disentangle the source sometimes.
Yeah.
Bowling Alone is a great book. I think it's almost a tragic book because things have gotten so much worse than when he wrote it. But
Yep.
basically, his argument is that since the sort of end of World War II, there's been a slow unraveling of civil society in the United States in particular, because civil society was much stronger in the United States, perhaps, and that this has all these negative downstream consequences, not only on our health and social lives and happiness, but on our democracy. And I'm not going to name any names, but I think we're witnessing that. I think we're witnessing the fallout of the fact that we don't go to bowling clubs and we don't interact with people that are not our like immediate. We don't have the same community. We don't have the same generalized trust. We have a cynical view of the nature of other people, of politicians, of institutions, and that's corrosive and it's difficult to get out of. And I think it's only getting worse. So sorry, but you know, it's a call to arms for why you should get to know your neighbors. The principles of cognitive science. So this cognitive neuroscience. So this is, I don't know whether I finished this book, but it's it's again a good standard text on this, methodologies and this kind of stuff. So I think it's good to like, neuroscience is one of those fields that if you just pick up a random neuroscience paper, it's going to be really difficult to make heads or tails of it, like the actual findings, if you don't have, like if you don't know what like EEGs are, or you don't know like the different types of techniques and what they show and what they don't show, and some of these sorts of ideas. So this is one of the books I've read. I've definitely taken some classes that I've found helpful. I think there's an MIT class, cognitive neuroscience, that I found helpful as well, but they talk about it, similar ideas. Fear and Courage by S.J. Rockman. I think he's actually from Vancouver, maybe, UBC, which is where I live. But this book is just absolutely amazing. He talks about basically it's an academic textbook talking about the research on fear and fear processes, particularly from psychology. But this is the book where I got the story from Get Better at Anything about the London Blitz and about how essentially all the psychologists were wrong. Like people predicted this mass panic that never actually happened. And so it shows that I think a lot of our common sense ideas about how fear and trauma and anxiety and these kinds of things work and what sustains them are out of step with what the actual research shows. Stephen Reed, Word Problems. I talked to him too when I was writing his book. So he was one of these guys that he did some of the work on transfer of problem solving skills and showing that you can teach someone a problem and then give them like actually the exact same problem, but with like a different cover story, and there was like zero transfer. I think I tend to be less impressed with that now. I think it has fewer implications than I thought. It's more a problem of like novices are bad at learning things abstractly enough, and that this does tend to ameliorate with practice effects. But this Word Problems is all of his research showing on like students who are attempting to solve word problems in mathematics. Everyone's favorite, two trains running together, 50 kilometers an hour or whatever. And just sort of showing how difficult this is to teach. But I tend to think it's more of a problem of these are harder problems, and just, you need a much stronger base of both the basic mathematics and of thinking through these types of situations. And that tends to not happen in school, but it's interesting.
I just wanted to make a couple notes here that we've seen a number of these LEA books, and I looked that up. It's Lawrence Erlbaum Associates, and they're big in cognitive psych, educational psych, instructional design, expertise and skill acquisition, and memory and learning sciences. So
I didn't even notice that. Yeah. No, I
yeah,
mean, I get a lot of my books, you can also see the MIT Press. I've been noticing those ones because they have a very distinctive logo, but these are academic publishers.
So apparently
Which
they did a lot of the early and important works by John R. Anderson, K. Anders
mm.
Ericsson, Robert J. Sternberg,
Oh
Richard E.
yeah, he's
Mayer,
all on there. Yeah.
and Herbert A. Simon. And
Yeah.
then the other thing I wanted to say about these word problems is just I think part of the reason that transfer doesn't happen is because that higher order of abstract thinking is never taught. And I think it's maybe difficult to teach. But if you don't, if you're always giving these word problems that are like fit into one of five categories of
Yeah.
life, you never, you could teach that high meta thinking, but it's never taught. And
Well,
so you have to maybe have some high IQ or something else to put the pieces together that are never connected for you.
I think I have a pretty good understanding of how it works now, so I don't wanna totally disagree with what you're saying, but I don't wanna go too much on a tangent. Basically, in order to transfer, like, math knowledge to a word problem or to real life, which is, I think, the bigger issue, right? There's a few things that are necessary. First, the skill needs to be underlying mathematical knowledge needs to be overlearned to a certain extent so that applying it is relatively easy. That's a big problem. Most people do not use math often enough to be fluent in it. So when they have recourse to use the math, it's too difficult to access. So it's sort of like, oh, this is algebra. Ah, I don't remember algebra, right? Okay, so that's problem number one. Problem number two, you need to have enough different examples of different surface forms to be able to form an abstract picture of something. This is a general idea in learning called concept learning. So for instance, when I see the letter, let's say the letter Q, right? If you think about it, I mean, maybe this is a good cover over if you can put it, but there's lots of different ways that Q, especially a capital Q or lowercase q, looks visually. And what we learn through seeing tons of different examples is to map all those different superficial forms to the same underlying concept. The same is true with problem solving. Oh, this is an example of this kind of problem in physics, let's say, or in math, or this kind of thing. And so the problem is that we don't get enough coverage of different ideas to map them all to this underlying thing that we need to be fluent in. And then second, you need to be able to spot a new type of problem as being an instance of this one. So that kind of extension can be hard as well. And so sometimes it's hard because when we learn in a classroom environment, the environment forms a bounding context on the problem itself. So if you only encounter algebra problems in algebra class, then that itself is a kind of negative weight to the activating algebra knowledge center of your brain when you're in another class. So it does mean it's very difficult to spontaneously use knowledge in novel contexts. And this is, I would say, generally speaking, a very big barrier on thinking. But it's not as big a barrier as it sounds because all that's required is for you to say, oh, hey, you know that it's an example of this. And you use this knowledge. And then as soon as you're told about it, you can apply the knowledge. So the transfer problem, I think, is a real one. And it does lead to a lot of skills being kind of inert in practice. And I don't think there's like a really good way around it, but I do think it's not necessarily as mysterious as it sounds. I don't think that we need to teach abstraction because I don't think you can. I think that abstraction is something that you learn from seeing lots of different examples that you learn to map to the same abstract concept. A little bit like a neural network learns these abstract ideas by seeing a set of different ideas that all get mapped to the same output. And that often, in order to learn or apply useful knowledge in a new domain, you require some kind of hint that this is the knowledge that's necessary because there's a little bit of a needle in a haystack problem. If I give you a problem, you have no idea how to solve it. You maybe don't have enough to go on to know which knowledge you already know might be relevant. So I think there is better ways for learning to transfer, but a lot of what it means to learn for transfer is just to really learn a subject. And we just don't get to that level of depth most of the time in school. And certainly with word problems. I mean, students are just barely able to do the easy problems. We're throwing word problems at them. So of course they're relying on these sort of terrible strategies of like, oh, when it's a car problem, I do this, right? Which is not a robust generalizable solution to the problem. But I think the challenge is just that, to really learn math in a way that you would be able to transfer and generalize, it would require a lot more work and practice and attention than, quite frankly, we have time or most students' interest to do. So that's
Yeah.
the problem.
I
Um,
guess we don't have to keep going on
yeah.
this, but I think where we probably disagree is just I do think abstraction and analogical thinking can be taught. I think it's
Mm,
very rarely taught in schools, and I teach a course on this topic under my mental models course, and I'm doing an advanced sequel to it. So I think we agree on sort of the general ideas of concept learning, and it's this largely implicit process. Um, and so, in terms of that theory of it, I would agree with your assessment of the literature and
Yeah.
just all that. Um, but anyways,
Well, we can talk about that at another time too. I
yeah,
do think that you can teach analogies. I don't want to be totally dismissive of that idea, but I think the bottleneck is usually insufficient ground knowledge. Like you just don't have enough grist to form an abstraction or an analogy. But it's often very useful for teaching because if you can tell someone this is the analogy, people are quite good at doing that. We have a sort of an analogizing faculty in some sense. But it's difficult to activate if you're not sure which thing actually analogizes with which thing. But definitely, it's probably something that you can, through attention, get people to notice more.
and analogies
This
used to
is
be a big thing on IQ tests, and they got rid of it.
analogies.
Yeah, on the old
Yeah.
SATs and IQ tests,
Mm.
analogies used to be one of the
Well,
major.
it probably does map to IQ a little bit because think about what you have to do when you have an analogy. You have to hold two different ideas in mind in your sort of consciousness. It's not implicit, like it is analogizing is very much a conscious process. It doesn't happen implicitly. You have this conscious process of you hold A and B, and then you have to find the isomorphism between these two different ideas. So it's a cognitively intensive process, and I would expect that not only does it depend on having prior knowledge, as all intelligence does, but my guess is that it would load on intelligence somewhat because, just to be able to keep all that in your head and do it successfully, it's just like doing mental math is difficult if you don't have enough working memory. So I would expect that there's probably some way to do it. And maybe there is some strategy. I don't want to be totally dismissive of the strategy for analogizing and abstracting, but just that I think in general, the problem of transfer and the problem of transfers for analogy, like it is a more general feature of human cognition that like, even scientists, it's sort of kind of surprising when people notice a connection outside of their field and stuff, right? Like it's not an automatic thing, right? Even among people who are very smart. And I think that's just based on human cognitive architecture rather than like some failure of pedagogy. It's just sort of how our brains work that, there's a million things that could be compared to a million things. And so how do you narrow that search space? It can be
Yeah.
hard sometimes. Handbook of Motivation and Learning. I read this when I was getting into, I think I did this Complete Guide to Motivation, and this was one of the books that I read. It's interesting. It's a little bit about like motivation and learning in students. It talks a little bit about, some of these factors that influence things like self-efficacy and stuff. I'd have to go over it again to see if it still holds up with my like current understanding. It's one of those books I read a long time ago. This Starting Strength. This was one of the ones that got recommended about doing weightlifting. I don't know. I don't know why I kept it. It's got good demonstrations of like how not to hurt yourself doing a squat. But I've also heard people who really think it's a bad book too. So I don't know
It's
whether I can
definitely a
recommend
classic
it.
in the field. I recognize
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Russell Norvig, we got to
Yeah.
it. Artificial Intelligence: A Modern Approach. It's interesting because this kind of predates a lot of deep learning stuff, right? I definitely bought it before that was like really in vogue. But it's good. I think people often want to learn the new thing and they don't want to learn the history. And the history is often important for learning the new thing.
Yeah.
Why zebras don't get ulcers. Oh, Sapolsky. He's a great writer. This book is about stress, and he covers lots of fascinating things about how stress impacts the body. And basically the title is that zebras don't get stressed because in the savannah, stress was a response to immediate physical danger, like a lion chasing after you. And human beings have taxes and exam deadlines and our own mortality to get us stressed even when there's no lion chasing us. And that causes all these problems. Motor learning and performance. Schmidt is a real, like, I would say classic like a expert in the field of like motor learning. So this is one of those areas where like I'd realized that this was a gap in my knowledge of learning, is I didn't have a good theory of motor learning. And so this book is really, I thought it was really fascinating because like motor learning happens under such tight time constraints, right? Like when you think about thinking, it's like extended over maybe like a problem solving. You might spend like minutes on a problem. Like hitting a baseball when it gets pitched to you, the speed at which information travels down nerves becomes a very important factor. Like basically there's all these limits on what your brain can do because of how fast it takes, like how fast you have to respond to something So like the decision of how to swing the baseball has to like be sent down your nervous system like before the ball has crossed like halfway on the plate. So there's no real like ability to like modify with feedback that kind of movement after it's been sent out because it just there's no time, right? And so there's sort of all these interesting time course of actions there, and he has a very cognitive perspective. There's another book that I read, or maybe it was an audible I listened to, and I'm trying to remember the author, How We Learn to Move, which has a very different perspective. It's much more like dynamical system approach. This is much more, we create a motor pattern. It can be an open or closed loop motor pattern, and that gets sent down to the spinal cord and stuff. So but it's more firmly ensconced in, I would say, this previous, well, still around cognitive paradigm, but I think now we're seeing more the ascendance of neuroscience, and this
I
is,
think
I would
of
say, much more a cognitive perspective.
like language learning and especially being able to speak. It is an extremely fast thing to do, and I think it's for me, it's one of the toughest parts of learning a new language or different phonemes is that you're learning these new motor patterns and you have
True.
to sequence them extremely quickly just to be able to speak at a normal rate.
But we do that. I think that's the interesting thing is like how much, I think there is a argument from, we're very impressed with these AI chatbots. And that's because to us, to speak and to talk about science and Shakespeare, this kind of stuff is like the pinnacle of intelligence. In the same way that like Deep Blue beating Kasparov was like chess was the pinnacle of human intelligence. And we forget that actually, like maybe 90% of our intelligence is the thing we share with the animals. That like, the way that a cat moves is just like insanely well optimized and complicated and sophisticated and stuff. It's not something we normally think of as intelligence, but in some ways, motor performance is the real thing that needs explaining because it's the thing that we clearly do much, much better than like algebra and stuff. We barely do algebra, but like, someone riding a bicycle or, typing on a keyboard or something, like just the fact that that can happen is, some pretty sophisticated learning going on. Schoen, reflective practitioner. This is another one of those classics. Yeah, his whole idea is double loop learning. This sort of like that you're learning through sort of feedback and then also your own kind of learning process. I don't know. It's one of those books that I think I gravitated toward more. It has a sort of heterodox flavor a little bit, like it's sort of like critiquing some of these um, models. I don't know whether I buy it today, but yeah, it's a classic book to read on that kind of like how do experts think and stuff. Scott, seeing like a state, he has the whole metis versus techne argument, basically the argument that like, um, in a lot of early societies, there was this sort of idea of imposing state control from this centralized place to sort of make things legible through systems of measurements, units, address, and like this is good for systems of control, but it tends to be less good for the people, which had a sort of self-organizing knowledge and system that was local and not really transferable. And so he has a lot of arguments against sort of these high modernist ideas of like, top-down planning projects of like Brasilia and Robert Moses and this kind of stuff. And he's very much in favor of like Jane Jacobs and these people who like focus on this sort of local um, people in their local environment making decisions and things growing kind of organically. It's an interesting book. Ritual and Its Consequences. You can't see it. It's still too glossy, but that's what that book is called. Ritual and Its Consequences. I did not read this whole book. I was recommended by Robin Hanson. And the basic idea, even though I didn't read the whole book, is that we live in a culture of sincerity, where the idea is that like what you're saying and what you're doing must be like truly, sincerely held beliefs. You must be authentic. Whereas previous cultures, it was more important that you enact the ritual, that like you do the behavior, whether or not your innermost feelings reflected that behavior. And that this is a bit of a shift, kind of maybe starting with the Protestant, Reformation and stuff that like, before that, a lot of religious rituals were just that. Like, it didn't matter whether you were like actually repentant, you went to confession or this kind of thing, right? Like, it was a little bit, it was phony into today's words, but they sort of argue that actually ritualized action and this sort of way of doing things maybe has some advantages to our sort of overemphasis on sincerity today. So it's an interesting idea, especially as a kind of countervail of this force of like authenticity is always good and sincerity is always good. But sometimes just doing the thing that you don't believe in because you're supposed to do it, or doing the thing irrespective of what your actual feelings about it are. Um, Maybe there's some merit in that, in like, that having its own power in society. The Craftsman. This is another book that I was read when I was on my apprenticeship bent, researching that. Yeah, he sort of talks about like, Homo faber, man the maker. It's a sort of philosophy book about like making things and doing one's hand and like kind of knowledge through doing. Ramizetti's book, it's a great intro personal finance book. This was another one I reread for the Money Month, but not everyone likes Setti's style, but I think his advice is pretty on point. Like there's very little to fault him in, like, he's giving people bad advice, which is not something I can say of a lot of financial pundits, so I give him that. Neurobiology. This is one I read a long time ago. It was probably my first neuroscience textbook. It's a good, just sort of fundamental neurons, how they work, nervous system. The Heroic Age of American Invention. So this is a nice little like series of stories about this sort of period of time in the 1800s in the United States where lots of people were inventing stuff. Like you can have the lone inventor coming up with some new product and trying to revolutionize society, as opposed to the sort of, Bell Labs institutional model or university model where like most decent inventions are now made as the process of like large teams and large corporations. It really was the case that like, you could tinker away and come up with something new. It's also showing how much those people were failures, that they like wanted to get rich from their invention and how rarely they did, and how often, the patent system just utterly failed them and they spent their life litigating and lost all their fortunes and stuff. So I think there's something almost tragic about the American inventor. For every Edison, there were many more people who ended up bankrupt despite contributing to mankind. And it says something a little bit about how do we foster innovation in a culture where ideas are something that, they're properly a public good. Steptoe, Genius in the Mind. This is another edited volume about genius, intelligence, creativity. I read it for a particular chapter I think Csikszentmihalyi wrote. I don't remember too much about it, but it definitely would have influenced. I maybe cited it in one or two places in Get Better at Anything. Singley and Anderson, Transfer of Cognitive Skill. This is the first one I read from them, and they're introducing this ACT system. At that time, it was called ACT Star. And they're sort of arguing that the right way to think about transfer of skills is in the formulating the skill in the series, in these series of what they call productions, which are like these if-then rules. So like, if you see something that has this form, then you do this action. And essentially you learn these and you become, as you practice them, they become more automatic and fluent. And that's what transfers when you transfer skills. So I don't know how relevant it is to the kind of transfer we were talking about, which is more declarative knowledge and more like coming up with a good analogy. But when you think about like skills learned with fluency, where you're doing them automatically without thinking, it's a good, I think it's a good theory of when that's going to transfer, when it's not going to transfer. And, it has some non-trivial predictions. Dean Simonton. I've been saying Simonton, but someone else was saying Simonton. So I don't actually
I've
know how to
always
say his
heard
last name,
Simonton.
but Simonton, yeah. I thought it was Simonton too, but then I heard someone say Simonton and I was like, is it Simonton? But Dean Simonton, he wrote a lot of books on creativity. He is famous for his equal odds rule. I had a whole chapter covering his research. I had a nice, interesting, like kind of back and forth with him, where it seems like he's kind of, I don't want to say repudiated some of his earlier ideas, but he seems to like be stepping away from some of the equal odds rule a little bit, which was unfortunate because it was after I'd written all of it and I'm getting him to like verify that I'm citing him correctly. And he's like, well, actually I've changed my mind a little bit on this. And I'm like, oh, okay. But he sort of was one of these like, I think, what would you call it? Psychological historians. I don't know what the right word is, but he was one of these people that was going back and looking at like actual track records of creative people over time and sort of trying to use statistical methods to figure out their work. And one of the things that he found was that more successful creatives are more prolific, and that there is a certain kind of like basically randomness to what of their works become successful. And so it's sort of like if kind of like the Wayne Gretzky quote, like if you want to, what is it, like you miss every shot you don't take, kind of, you miss every intellectual shot you don't take, and that people who are very prolific tend to have successful creative careers. That seems to be maybe not 100% like as strong a rule as it used to be. There definitely are kind of like paper factory type scientists that produce a lot of low quality work, and people who produce very little but very high quality work. But it does sort of show the inherent random process in creative work, and indeed in creative genius. And so greatness is not just about that, but he talks a lot about other things like the role of, certain psychological variables in people who, make great things, right?
Yeah, I mean, his stuff has really inspired me to try to be prolific and try to just kind
Yeah.
of force myself. And you have, I mean, you've written a blog post every week for like how long? Over a decade?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. It's funny because that was my book, Get Better at Anything, was coming out at the same time as Slow Productivity. And I was like, oh man, I have this whole chapter where I argue you got to do more. And then slow productivity is you got to do less. And I don't think they're actually so opposed, because I think what Cal is trying to talk about in that book is sort of like this, he opens with this guy, and I forget who he opens with in Slow Productivity. I don't remember his name. But like his whole point is that he's spending these months, this sort of leisurely working on this magazine
McPhee or
piece.
McGee?
Yeah, McPhee, right? He's leisurely working on this magazine piece, and then that leads to this great work and this kind of thing. But if you look at the actual guy, he's written a lot, right? So he's not really a contradiction in terms. So I think, even Cal Newport is someone that, you could be like, oh, well, he's, the deep work guy, this kind of thing. Like, I don't know, how many books has he written? Like 7 or 8? Like, he's no slouch there, right? He's written more books than I have. He's also writing essays all the time and doing stuff all the time. So I think sometimes there is a higher level synthesis that focusing, doing the work, taking your time, trying to do your absolute best is often combined with this sort of like the overlap is this sort of obsessive quality with doing the work well that tends to this, the kind of person who doesn't contribute creatively is the person that's sort of like constantly getting in their own way psychologically. They're not making stuff. They're just paralyzed. They're like, oh, I have to make it perfect before, whereas the person is just like, I'm going to do the best possible work that I can. And I'm really driven by this seeking of quality of getting the right answer. But I don't have that mental holdup that keeps me from writing things and publishing things. Theory of Computation. So this book was the textbook for the class that I took. So when I was doing the MIT challenge, I got to preface this. When I was doing the MIT challenge, I was mostly doing MIT open courses, but there was sort of like electives. I don't remember how I made this decision, but there were kind of electives that you could sort of pick anything in computer science, like to get the degree. And I would remember talking to Cal at the time, because Cal was, I don't know if he was a professor, maybe he was just a postdoc, but he was teaching classes at MIT, like as a postdoc or whatever. And I was like, oh, I'd like to take one of your classes. Or maybe he was at Georgetown, or maybe he was already at Georgetown. I don't know. Yeah, he could have been at Georgetown. And I was like, I'd like to take one of your classes. And so it was like because I needed, I know what it was. I needed 2 graduate level classes. And they didn't have that many on MIT. And I was like, oh, could I do one of yours? And so there was a theory of computation class. And this was the textbook for it. And I remember writing a Cal Newport exam that he sent me,
That's awesome.
the raw exam. So that was fun. But theory of computation it's a lot of Chomsky, actually. It's a lot of like grammars and different languages that can express different things. So showing the great links between computer science and cognitive science. So they're all one. Skian, this is a cognitive approach to language learning. Yeah, this is another one of those books that I don't think I actually read this during my SLA binge, but it was in my kind of like learning about how the kind of cognitive perspective I was learning for Get Better at Anything applies to language learning. And I am blanking a little bit on specific findings, but I definitely know I cited it in a few places. So I'd have to jog my memory about what exactly I cited. Oh, Sternberg, we're back to Sternberg again, Handbook of Creativity. Again, I don't really like his theories, but this is an edited volume and there's lots of good stuff in there. And there's another one, Sternberg in French, Complex Problem Solving. This is one of the ones where you read the whole book. Okay. So what is complex problem solving? So problem solving, we go back to Newell and Simon. This is this like theory of like there's a problem space and then you do these heuristical moves to try to navigate the problem space to get to your destination. And they're trying to understand how people solve problems. And this complex problem solving was a little bit of a subfield that emerged. I don't know whether it's still active. It was a little bit of subfield where they were looking at like really complicated problem spaces and just sort of like how do people deal with problems. I think maybe under the idea that like they're more realistic, although they were often like studying them with these like laboratory simulations. So it wasn't like complex problem solving meant real world problem solving. It meant like, here's a computer simulated factory with like 400 variables that you can control. Like, how do people learn how to do it?
Wow.
And I don't know, I remember reading it. There's some good chapters in here, so it wasn't like a complete waste, but I remember getting the last chapter because it's an edited volume, right? So you're reading each author and they're presenting their research. And then the last chapter is often someone commenting on everyone's work. And he's so disparaging. He's sort of like, this is all BS. And it's the last chapter of the book. So you get to this chapter and he's kind of like, this is just, you know, what you guys are doing. People aren't learning anything. If you ask how people solve complex problems, they don't. You know, like this is I don't know. It was just an amusing thing that you read through this whole book and then like, oh, that's the rebuttal, is that the last
That's
chapter
awesome.
is like,
Yeah.
this work is not good. Buddhisms, John S. Strong. I kind of went through a bit of a like deep dive. Well, as a deep dive for me, I don't want to exaggerate, into Buddhism. I was very interested in meditation. This is a little bit before Ultralearning came out, maybe like 2018. It was very interesting to me. It's less central now, but maybe also because I've sort of absorbed a lot of the Buddhist worldview that I kind of take it for granted in a way that it felt alien to me at the time. But this book, Buddhisms, is more academic, less religious. It's more about the history of Buddhism and different sects like Theravada, Mahayana, you know, the different belief systems. My favorite thing from this book was his comment that a lot of Western interpreters, when they hear stories of the Buddha, hear stories that are this weird mix of like him being a regular Joe, like he's just an ordinary person who got enlightenment, and then also stories about like he has magic powers and he can fly everywhere and go to heaven and lick his own, you know, turn his head around like an owl 360 degrees and stuff. And Western interpreters tend to see the magical stuff as being the like fake stuff that was added on, and the humanist stuff as being like the real story of the Buddha. When Strong kind of makes the case that no, actually they both, neither of them are more grounded in fact. They're just that they're both rhetorically illustrating different aspects of the philosophy. That like the humanist stuff is the grounding of the religious idea that enlightenment is a path that is, at least in theory, open to any individual with hard work and practice. And so they're grounding the Buddha as being an actual person. And then all the magical stuff is to, you know, really highlight how great a guy this person was. And that in the time period, the magical stuff was seen as realistic. Like this is, you know, ancient India, you know, you got the Vedics, like they thought there were hells and gods and reincarnation. That was just accepted. That was just like the worldview of how the world worked. And so it's only today that, like, you know, as a Westerner, you look at that and you're like, oh, him traveling to the heavens and talking to the gods, like that's the magical fake part that's been added to the story. And it's like, no, but that was also part of the worldview at the time. So it wasn't like people at the time saw it as like, oh, well, this is the fantastical stuff and this is the practical stuff. So I don't know, but it's a good book just giving an introduction to Buddhism, if that's something you're interested in. I don't know what the publisher is. You're very interested in the publisher. This is something I never notice on books, and now I'm noticing it, you know?
Yeah, there's
We're
some of
talking
these
about
older
attention here.
Yale
Yale,
logos
yeah.
as well.
Mm-hmm.
I read a lot of stuff by university presses, and so I'm always kind of wondering,
yeah.
each university press has kind of their own niche. And
yeah. So this one would be the last because it ends in Z, but we've got Eat, Drink, and Be Healthy. Did that for Foundations. That's the best book on healthy eating. It is written by the most cited nutritionist in the world. I think it's funny because even that, I think there's been some change in expert opinion since it was written. So the drink part, the Mediterranean diet used to recommend having a moderate amount of alcohol because of this hypothesized J-shaped curve where like the mortality was lowest for people who were moderate drinkers, like one drink per day. And now better research suggests that there's no benefit for alcohol consumption. Not that you need to stop drinking, but that, that glass of wine for your heart is maybe overrated, and that the cancer risk swamps any health benefits. But the broad stuff that he talks about, reducing saturated fat, eating more of fruits and vegetables, a lot of the things where he's sort of attacking, I would say, the misunderstandings in popular nutrition are dead on. And so that Red Pen Reviews, this is the #1 ranked book for it's generally adhering to scientific accuracy, with, again, maybe that caveat that the nutritional consensus is shifting somewhat on the role of alcohol. Wheel, Economic Growth. Oh yeah, this is a good book. I don't know. I love economics. I think if I had to go back and do a PhD, I might do economics. I think it's just a fascinating field. And economic growth is one of these ones where we really underrate how much poverty is the default. I think we kind of look around and see this society, and there's this tendency to kind of almost complain about it. Like anything that's not great is well, this is terrible, or this kind of thing. And we don't realize how kind of almost fantastical the material wealth that we live in, that we have abundant food and energy and, everything, just to this extreme degree. And especially places, in the West and developed countries, I think there's a particular kind of blind spot that we have, often because a lot of people in a lot of countries are not as rich. And so this economic growth is a little bit talking about what are some of the processes that underlie why some countries are rich and why some are poor, and what results in economic growth. It's a good textbook on it.
It seems like a lot of
Um,
this robotic stuff and AI is going to potentially throw a wrench in a lot of the old or sort of established theories.
I don't know. I don't know whether it will actually. I think, this is a whole separate conversation that could take 3 hours, but I tend to think that that the all the I tend to think that AI is going to be a big deal, but I think that the people talking about how big a deal AI is going to be underestimate how adaptable human beings are. That we can have dramatic changes to our material cultural environment, and they just become normal really quickly. I mean, even today, we're living in a world where there is a chat bot that's would have seemed like magic to me 4 years ago, and it's just kind of banal, oh yeah, I just asked ChatGPT that thing. So I don't know. I mean, there is obviously the possibility of mass unemployment and all these kind of things. So I don't want to be too, or mass extinction or some of these fatalistic things, but I tend to think the scenario is going to be that 30 years from now, it's going to be a radically different world, and it's just going to feel normal. And, people are going to keep going on in their lives, and, they're going to work jobs, but they'll work different jobs. And, that's what I tend to think is going to happen, at least if none of the really catastrophic visions come to pass.
Do you think UBI is going to come pretty soon, or?
Well, I don't know. I think politically it's going to be very hard to get that going, for the same reason it's been hard to get other stuff going. But I mean, I think we've been just generally shifting towards offering larger governments, more generous social services. If there were actual mass unemployment on 80% unemployment kind of thing, then probably you'd have either UBI or some kind of political revolution. But I think probably what it's going to look like is just, again, it's not going to be, I don't think there's going to be a phase change shift. I think it's just going to be, some industries, some careers are going to have a big decline. But I think that people are going to still be doing work. They're going to be doing different kinds of work, and it's going to be integrated with AI. That's what I tend to think. But
Yeah.
I mean, we'll see. We'll see. Who knows, right? Productive Thinking, Wertheimer, Gestalt Psychologist. This is one of those books that's kind of amazing to read, because it's from another completely different paradigm, but it's discovering some of the same ideas. So the Gestalt psychology is very interesting to me because it was really grounded in Germany in this sort of pre-war era. It has in many ways as its roots a lot of the incipient ideas of cognitive science, cognitive psychology, this idea of mental states, of perceptions, of not the same language, but a lot of the same ideas are grounded in Gestalt psychology. But what happens is, World War II, Hitler rises to power. All these Gestalt psychologists get transplanted to the United States, where they're the underdogs now. The behaviorism is in full force. And so even though like Lewin and some of these Gestaltists still have some influence, they're kind of marginalized because behaviorism is essentially banned their kind of psychology. And so you have this sort of like abortive psychological paradigm that, it takes until Chomsky and all these other guys later to sort of revive under a very different idea of this computer metaphor. And so productive thinking is, so productive in Wertheimer is more like creative thinking or like problem solving. And so he's in some ways anticipating Simon's work. And Simon specifically, explicitly draws on Gestaltist work. De Vroet with the chess chunking and this kind of stuff. Like these are all people operating out of this Gestaltist tradition and this perceptual idea of, seeing chunks and things like this. But he has this great idea about like, how do you transfer problems? How do you transfer ideas that only very later gets expressed in this sort of cognitive paradigm? But it was Meyer. I was talking to him on the phone and I was like, what should I read to like make sense of this mess that was at the time in my head of this subject? And he's like, you should read Wertheimer. And so I was like, okay. And so I got this book and I love it. It's falling apart a bit though. I got to tape some of the pages in. Whitehead, The Aims of Education. I've not read this full book. This is one of those IOUs a little bit. I started reading it, but I didn't have time. But Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead is like famous philosopher, and this is his little book about. This is where he introduces the idea of inert knowledge. This is what he's most known for, just the idea that you can have knowledge that you've learned in school, but is not transferable. It's not activated, and you can't use it in some ways. And I think we've talked a little bit about what I think now are some of the reasons for that. Understanding nutrition. So this, I mentioned the phone book before when we were in D, which was the sort of dietitian one. So that was like, these are the guidelines. This is how you should eat based on science. And this one is a little bit more, what are the underlying mechanisms? What are the things? So I thought this was fascinating too, especially with things like, just how different, like it's actually kind of amazing that we can sort of eat, like the body is very versatile in like being able to make use of all different sources of food to like kind of get to the same point of having calories. Like, so you can have like a pretty varied diet and still, because your body has like all these crazy different metabolic pathways to like, digest carbohydrates and fats and make use of different things. It's really this, oh, this is what's available. I'm going to make use of this. But the nutrition book, this was a good one for giving some of the foundations in like metabolism, some of these basic biological processes. The Evolution of Management Thought. So this book, I was thinking about doing a complete guide to productivity like I did some other complete guides, and there was going to be a whole section on like the history of productivity, the history of thinking on productivity. And so I read a lot of books, which incidentally are not here, but like, Scientific Management by Taylor and Galbraith and a bunch of those early books. And then this book sort of charts the thinking on management, sort of from that scientific management era into the more humanist era. And like, it's sort of a textbook kind of charting the philosophy of like, what's the way to manage organizations and people and motivate them and stuff, and how that's changed over time. And Zuckerman, Scientific Elite, Harriet Zuckerman, she did this study of American Nobel Prize winning scientists and trying to figure out kind of like sociologically how they came about. And one of the things that she found was that it is really this like model of apprenticeship where like being trained by an elite scientist has such a huge impact on whether you yourself produce elite scientists, that it's these network effects and the ability for, elite scientists to know what sorts of problems to work on and what sorts of things to work on. So it's a fascinating book if, maybe a little bit depressing if you're outside of that elite and you're wanting to contribute to this knowledge enterprise. You really realize, oh no, it's like, it is a very concentrated domain where like a very few people have all this kind of intellectual power to contribute, I think, especially today.
And there's sort of some economic, you talked about principal agent and apprenticeships, and there's sort of some interesting game theory and economics as to why that would exist.
Well, so in the Apprentice to Genius, the Knagle book, there's a whole thing about a scandal where one of the, in one of the generations of apprenticeship, there was this woman who she did most of the work, which is kind of par for the course. She's doing a lot of the work, but then her advisor was being nominated for, I think it was Alaska or something like that. And she threw a big fit over it, that he was getting this credit for what was her work and what he truly thought of like, this is how it works. Like, I am the mentor. I'm the one who's running the lab and doing this kind of thing. Like, who cares if you do most of the work? Like, I'm due in the same way that I was helping out my advisors, and like, this is the system that you belong to. And she raised a big fuss about it, and he never got the award, and there was like some bitterness about it. But it's pretty clear that, like, you know, if you are citing someone, and I'm certainly doing this now where I'm talking about so many of these psychologists, you're really talking about teams, right? You're not talking about individuals. It's not that guy who did all that work. He had a whole group of people working with him, and maybe some of those ideas were some postdoc who you've never heard of before, who, after couldn't get a tenure position and quit the academy, and, this kind of thing. And so I do think science is changing a little bit, but, it is this kind of, in some ways, it is very much this model of apprenticeship where you have a lot of unequal power dynamics and this kind of stuff. It's sort of interesting that, like, in some ways, the inegalitarianism of academia combined with, like, what you could imagine is there's a lot of, pro egalitarian political sentiment in academia. Maybe it's a reflection of just like how unequal the working environment is, that a lot of people who are, academics like socialism, they like communism because, they just see kind of like the manifest injustice of the environment that they are operating in, right?
Yeah.
And how the spoils go to these very few prestigious people. Yeah, Taleb, Black Swan, Anti-Fragile. So he's got good ideas. I actually hate Taleb as a writer. I don't like reading his books. I feel like he's very dismissive and pugilistic, and
Yeah.
he just has the opposite of the tone that I try to write and when I'm thinking about things. But he does have some good ideas. And the Black Swan is all about how probabilistic models, particularly in finance, undercount events that have never happened before. So they kind of assume because it's never happened before, it never can happen. And that's a category error. And then Anti-Fragile is a more general book where he's talking about systems that benefit from some amount of disorder, particularly organic biological systems. And I also think it's valuable. Although, sometimes you could say that an anti-fragile system is not necessarily a good one either. Like someone could argue that, like, Donald Trump's political style is an anti-fragile one, where, like, it doesn't matter what scandal happens, it doesn't hurt him too much because he's kind of set himself up as being a somewhat amoral power broker type person. But I don't know that that's necessarily good. It's good to have integrity, even if integrity is itself the fragile solution. So anyways, they're good books, good ideas, but he frustrates me sometimes as a writer. Walden, I've never read Walden. I kept it because I want to read it, but yeah, I don't know. I have like mixed feelings about the Transcendentalists. Like Emerson too. I was reading his The Conduct of Life, and I don't know. Maybe I'm just like too steadfastly materialistic in my viewpoint, but I find the romantics sometimes. But I mean, they're important American thinkers.
Yeah.
It's not in here because I read it on Audible, and we're getting the end of this little book tour. But the Metaphysical Club,
Yeah.
and the American Pragmatists, very good.
What's
book.
that guy's name? The
Louis
author?
Menand.
Menand.
I think it's Louis Menand, right?
Yeah.
The Metaphysical Club. He's done a few. He also did one about art during the Cold War, which I really liked as well.
Yeah. Everything he does is good. He was a big New Yorker guy as well.
Yeah. One of those ones where, like, there's writers that you read where you're just like, I'm never gonna be this good a writer.
Yeah.
So you just got to enjoy it. Thorndike. Oh yeah. So this is a really old book. This is The Principles of Teaching Based on Psychology. And this is one of the ones where he really introduces this idea. He attacks what he calls formal discipline theory, which is this idea that that the mind is like a muscle and that you can train it with particular exercises that have this general capacity. And Thorndike he's kind of even pre-behaviorist. He's sort of an associationist, but he he's sort of arguing for the idea that learning is just kind of habits. Now, I wouldn't say that that's true. That's more too behavioristic for me. But he does make a good case that formal discipline theory, which still exists today, people still, invoke it implicitly when they're making all sorts of educational pleas, that this is not correct. This Tobias and Duffy one, constructivist instruction. This is like, so I was telling you about the direct instruction constructivism debate. It is a raging debate. This book is the debate. This book is like the constructivist side and the direct instruction side, and then they have at it and share their research. I would say that the direct instruction comes away looking better than the constructivists in this book. However, I think there has been some more recent people of a little bit more of a constructivist leaning, like I'm thinking of Manu Kapoor's work on productive failure, that kind of like rehabilitates slightly this idea that, struggling on hard problems has pedagogical value, but it seems to be under specific circumstances rather than as a, throw kids in the deep end and they're going to learn to swim better idea. Tough. The adults learning projects. I read this one for Ultralearning because it's about adult self-education and kind of looking at people and the kinds of educational projects that they undergo and this kind of stuff. I don't remember that many specifics about it, but I do remember him kind of talking about like that average people, average adults actually do quite a few projects where the goal is to learn things. And so, self-education is actually pretty universal, even if it's not always under like ideas of like academic or intellectual ideas. Like it could be, learning to fix your car or things like that. So he has some good stuff there.
I
It's a
never
nice
found
little
the
monograph.
adult education literature to be particularly useful for our kind of like self-directed learning stuff, but I don't know if you have any thoughts
I
on
don't
that.
know. I mean, I think that book was interesting just as a kind of like survey of like, well, what do people actually do when they're learning? Like, it's more descriptive, I think, than prescriptive. So it doesn't really like say, these are all the translated editions of books
Oh, wow. Nice.
that I have. So that orange one is Spanish, I think Arabic, Italian, traditional Chinese, and then, yeah. I'm going to be getting these ones. Zosten, Ultra, Samukim. Is that Polish? Ooh, I don't know. Brazilian, Ultra Učenje. That's Serbian. Japanese, Russian. Ooh, what's this one? Maybe Lithuanian? Ooh, I don't know. I don't know all of them. Korean. This one here is just Ultralearning. Is that the German one? I don't know. It's in English, though. Sometimes they didn't translate it.
Verlag
I think this one's
is
Turkish,
German.
maybe? Spartusis Mokimasas. I'm going to be like, I'm saying it like I'm pronouncing it properly, and there's going to be actual, like, people who speak that language who are just nails on a chalkboard right now. And then I've got a few for Get Better at Anything. Although the translations take so long that like we've signed deals for it, but like Mejora en Todo is one of the few that I've actually gotten a copy of. I have a few at my house that I got to bring that I have. But yeah, it's kind of nice. It's nice getting the translations. I don't know what to do with them always, but these are books in Chinese that I've maybe read to some extent. So got Three Body Problem. I got the whole series there. I only read about I read the first one and like half of the second one. Everyone really, really likes that book for like Chinese science fiction, but I don't know. It was okay. But it wasn't like my favorite book ever. I think of these books here, I actually like the more literary ones a bit more, like Moyan's Wa or Frog, which is the red book that's like the nicer cover, is an excellent book. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. I think he's the only Chinese person to do so. And I keep trying to read Red Sorghum, which is the one next to it. I keep trying to read Red Sorghum, and I get I'll make a few pages at a time, but it's hard because I don't know, my Chinese reading ability for like this kind of literature is it's sluggish. And it's also hard too because he likes to do these like kind of country bumpkin type characters. So they also speak in a very dialectical way, which makes it harder to follow. Journey to the West, COG. I've had that book forever, and I imagine I'll read it one day, But then I just gave up and started reading it in English because it's just too old. The Chinese, I can't make sense of it. It's even difficult to read in English sometimes. To Live, Huazi by what's his name? Forgetting the author's name. But he's a great author. That one's really good. They made a movie out of it, but I haven't watched it. I have gone midway through Brothers, the Xiongdi, but that one's good. And then those ones, the white ones on the very end, are Chinese translations of my ebooks in China. So there's 如何高效学习, which is learn more, study less. And then, those are some books that my Chinese publisher published. And then I have a few other ones there too. I think I have, I don't know, but I don't have that many Chinese books. And these are the ones that I kept. I kind of got rid of all my all of my sort of learner resources that I'm like, oh, I don't really need this anymore. So this is what was preserved.
So I had an idea of how we could get through all of these in like 10 minutes.
Okay, this is a lightning round.
Let's do a lightning round of like the best book, and you don't have to say, maybe you can say one sentence about each one, and then we'll just kind of go through all these screenshots very quickly.
All right. I'll just pick one book on each because we got so many. All right. Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. Very good. Everyone knows The Wealth of Nations. This is maybe the better book. Ooh, let's go with, I liked Why Marriages Succeed or Fail. So this is great book on sort of research on conflict resolution. And he finds in particular that like different styles of conflict resolution have a very predictive accuracy of whether you're going to stay married with your spouse. So if you fight with your spouse a lot, it's a good one to read. I don't fight with my spouse a lot, but it was good to see that why my strategy works. Ooh, what about here? Oh, I got Le Comte de Monte Cristo. I listened to that one in French. That one took me a while. It was like 50 hours. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of books here. A Random Walk Down Wall Street. Best book on investing. Burton Malkiel. This is this index fund idea I was talking about. It really argues it there. What do we have here? Yeah, so the 6 Easy Pieces by Feynman is a good one for there's 2 there actually. There's 6 not so easy pieces and 6 easy pieces, which is like that those red books I had, this is like the kind of Cole's Notes version of them. There's a bit of audio quality problems with one of them though, so just heads up. I liked 7 Games. 7 Games is up in the corner. This is a nonfiction book about games, and it has like a lot of overlap with like computer science and like how people, like what's the theory of optimal play for those games. It's another example of like, I don't know, a topic that maybe you wouldn't look at that much. That I like. I really like that kind of nonfiction. Let's see. The Mind is Flat by Nick Chater. That's a great book. His basic thesis is that there is what he calls the grand illusion, which is that there's so much less to our consciousness than appears. Like we know from visual studies that we can actually only perceive detail and color in this like very tiny little window. Like if you hold like I don't know, a large coin about your arm outstretched, that's about how much you can actually see vision and color. But I mean, the whole room looks colorful, right? Feels like there's detail everywhere, but there isn't. And so that's the grand illusion. That's the visual example, but it applies much more broadly that we're just essentially deceived about how much information is actually in our consciousness and how much like there's much less subconscious stuff going on than he's arguing, at least in this idea that there's no Freudian subconscious content going on. Very interesting book. I enjoyed it. Oh yeah, the Metaphysical Club, that's there too. Okay, yeah, read that one as well.
Is there any connection with Freudianism and learning theory that you've ever found useful?
I'm like a pretty anti-Freud kind of person. I know it's like now I've been like following people where it's a little bit trendy to like say that he was actually right about some things. But I just feel like he's so wrong about so much stuff that like you really have to twist yourself in knots to find the things that are valuable. And he continues to have a lot of influence. So I think it's worth pushing back on though. Like, so I'm pretty much in the anti-Freud camp of, yeah, you can twist it and find out, oh, I guess actually Freud, was right about this thing or that thing. But I mean, he had a lot of theory, and I think a lot of the theory is just wrong.
Yeah. Got a number of great courses here.
Oh yeah, I did a bit of a great courses binge. I feel like I got the ones that I wanted. I'll have to check again. But like, yeah, History of India was good.
Were
There's
these modern?
oh yeah, this is how I got onto Heidegger too, was this the modern intellectual tradition, Descartes to Derrida, and that one's about epistemology and ontology, and then the modern political tradition is more about like a normative philosophy. And so great courses are great because they're quite expensive if you buy them on their own, but if you get them on Audible, you can use Audible credits. And I like courses, I like textbooks, I like ones where it's like, okay, I'm just gonna like tell you straight this topic that you don't know about. I'm not gonna try to like tell you why all the experts are wrong kind of thing, which tends to infect a lot of nonfiction writing. Like if I don't actually know what the experts think, then it's not always
Yeah.
helpful.
And a lot of library subscriptions, or a lot of libraries
Mhm.
will actually let you get like access to one or two of these per month.
Yeah.
So worth checking out.
What is good here? Oh, right. I would say God biography. So I think that's, yeah, that one there. Very interesting book. So basically, if you think about Hamlet, for instance, you could do a literary analysis of the character of Hamlet without believing Hamlet is real, right? And so what the author, Jack Miles, who is a Christian, so I want to make that clear in the this is not just like an atheist doing this, but he wants to do an analysis of the literary character of God in the Old Testament. And I think he's doing it in the Hebrew order, so the like Tanakh. Um, he wants to do an analysis of the literary character that God presents in the Bible. So like if you were reading it as a piece of literature, so it's independent of its truth value, just this is a literary work. Let's do a character analysis of God in the Bible. And it's very interesting. And I admit I'm not like that deep in my Judeo-Christian religious studies. So maybe if you are immersed in it, you'd have a different perspective. But I thought it was fascinating. It was a good coverage of the Bible, but also like kind of, trying to make sense of this it's just a fantastical kind of document too. So, and then he has one about Jesus as well. And I started reading the one about the Quran, but I didn't get that far into it. So, yeah, what do I have here? Oh, Wizard and the Prophet's really good. Charles C. Mann's a great guy. Read all of his books. This is basically talking about how there are the wizards, who are people who believe in technology to fix our environmental problems, and the prophets, who believe that like we're kind of headed for disaster and that the only solution is sort of repentance and reform. And these sort of dueling visions of the environmentalist movement. And I firmly am more in the wizard camp than the prophet camp. But it's interesting because you see these cultural narratives play out in our current climate crisis and everything else that's going on. All right. Oh, are we up to where I am right now? So let's see. Simon Winchester was a recent find that I found. So this, The Perfectionists, over on the left, is a great one. Um, it's about the history of precision engineering, but it was one of those ones where like I had never heard of him before, and he's written like a million books. So I'm like, oh, I'm gonna have to read more of his books. I also finished The Fracture Zone, which is about the Balkans, which I have a Balkan wife, so I was interested in that for also personal reasons. And yeah.
Now into the Kindle.
Okay. Oh, geez, books, Kindle. All right. Where do we go? Proto is really good. About Proto-Indo-European, Laura Spinney. That's a fairly recent book. Came out. It's about basically how half the world's people kind of originated, our languages originated as this like thing spoken by this tribe of people who kind of probably lived near um uh oh, near like sorry, I'm blanking on the name. Crimea, I was gonna say. Near Crimea. That was like around that area, Ukraine. That was where this sort of tribe of people lived, and all the branches of
Do
the
you read
world
these
that
on
came from that.
on e-ink, or do you have a tablet, or just on the computer?
Kindle, although I do often read on my phone, actually,
Oh, okay.
because I always have my phone. So it's,
Yeah.
it's harder to read on your phone. You get distracted. But over here, what did I like? Cognitive Behavior Therapy by Judith Beck. Everyone should know that. It's just such a good mental model of how thinking works, especially for things like anxiety, depression. It's one of the most, I would say it's like the pillar of most modern scientifically informed therapies, even though there's some third wave ones that kind of like, like ACT and some of these ones that go beyond it. It's a really good book. And I think it has this basic framework that I reflect on all the time when I'm thinking about these kinds of problems.
And so Judith Beck here is the daughter of
Aaron Beck, yeah.
who's the founder.
She's also a practitioner in her own right, but yeah, she's the daughter of the guy who founded the thing. Oh, what do we have here? Well, I already talked about Bowling Alone. So that one I have as a Kindle as well, I guess. Let's go Checklist Manifesto. That's a good short book. Atul Gawande is great. This is like a simple idea that's really powerful. So just having checklists makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
And in a medical context, saves a lot of people's lives. Let's go. I enjoyed, I don't actually know whether I finished it all the way, but How Asia Works by Joe Studwell. Sort of talk about the economic development in East Asia. So I think he does. There's a lot of East Asian countries. I didn't realize he wasn't an economist. He's just a sort of a writer, but he's very intelligent and informed. But he sort of talks about industrial policy and about like basically why places like Japan and Korea and Taiwan are relatively rich, even though they were quite poor until recently. All right, where are we? Why Knowledge Matters, E.D. Hirsch, another good book. So this one, he's talking specifically about like why we should be teaching, he is providing the steel man for the counter argument against, we should teach kids how to think and not what to think. And he's really arguing, no, we need to teach kids what to think. The content is the education, the knowledge matters. And he's particularly looking at the area of like, once you learn basic phonics, once you basically learn the decoding rules, what affects reading comprehension is having more knowledge. And that all these sorts of fancy reading strategies that often get taught under the auspices of like, well, we're going to teach people a strategy are just not as effective as teaching them content knowledge. Where are we here? Let's do The Republic, Plato's Republic. That's a good book. I mean, it's a classic. I don't know whether I need to like persuade anyone to read it, but it's a much weirder book than I was expecting, Like it's a bizarre book. Like he's just talking about this, like it reads like science fiction. Like it's just a strange, wonderful, interesting, thought-provoking book. But a lot of these classic books, you'll read them and they're much weirder than you'd think they'd be, given their like, place in the canon, right? So Plato's certainly in that bunch. Where are we here? What's a good one? Well, so I would go to we've talked a lot about Anderson. Let's skip that. Let's talk about Alchemy. I think there's one, Alchemy Tried in Fire. No, the other one next to it. There, it's which one is by Principe? Are they both by Principe? Secrets of Alchemy. So Alchemy was a thing. I ended up reducing it to a single paragraph in Get Better at Anything, but I read a lot about it, and it is fascinating to me because alchemy, we have this sort of connotation of like this was magic and it's superstition, and of course it was, but really you see a kind of this is what chemistry was before chemistry, right? And they had the wrong theory in a lot of ways, but they weren't utterly unscientific. They weren't utterly unempirical. the main impediment to alchemy becoming chemistry was not that they had the wrong ideas, but that they had the wrong methods of communicating those ideas. And so they used this sort of esoteric writing system where they were like trying to really hide what they knew and the knowledge they have. And it's fascinating, but it just basically it prevented people from gaining knowledge because you couldn't build on anyone's work because they were always trying to hide stuff from you. So if you copied their experiment and it didn't work, it didn't necessarily mean that their experiment was wrong. It could mean that you didn't understand it or you didn't decode it properly. And
Well,
so I don't know. This is just this like little slice of history that is fascinating to me.
yeah, it sounds really interesting.
Where are we here? Let's go. I liked. Let's go with. I like Code Breakers. That's a relatively new book about CRISPR. So, sort of going in what we were talking about, like this sort of scientific process. I like these biographies of like how science actually happens. And this one's fairly recent, right? So sort of about basically how we made this very important biological discovery. And then of course, Walter Isaacson is always good to read. You can't go wrong with an Isaacson biography. So if you just go to the bookstore and find Isaacson, pick up anyone, you're not going to be disappointed. His Jobs biography is also good. What do we have here? Let's go with so this is a funny one. I actually did a sort of dueling book review on my blog of Measure What Matters by John Doerr, which is about metrics and why you need to have like metrics and KPIs in your organization for success. And then the one right after that, so it's on the other side of the screen, is The Tyranny of Metrics. And it's just all talking about how having these sort of metrics and goals can have this corrupting influence on the professions. I don't know. After reading both the books, I feel like it was difficult to synthesize them because they kind of make really opposite arguments. But Muller's case is that like is basically Goodhart's law that like when you optimize for one thing, it has these unintended consequences. And especially institutionally, where it's often hard to really, you're not the one setting the metric, it's your boss's boss's boss who's telling you drive KPI X. And so you do it in ways that undermine the original reason it was selected. And then Doerr, I think, is really building on a lot of the research by Edwin Locke and Latham, and particularly his experience in Intel of how setting specific, measurable, hard goals has this important role in motivating performance. So I think they can both be right, but there's sometimes a trade-off between them. Not that good work if you can get it. I'm not an academic, but this is like the book that explains how you would actually succeed in academia. And I think this should be required reading before anyone signs up for grad school with the intention to go into it. Also, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, Richard Rorty is great too. That's probably his best book. Let's go with something deeply hidden. Sean Carroll. He's written a lot of popular science books, but I like him because, someone else, and maybe it was Robin Hanson, kind of made this point about Carroll that like, he espouses what I would call like the standard scientific worldview of like people who know physics and have this kind of perspective, have this like, what how the world works and this kind of thing. But it's not widely appreciated or shared by a lot of people. Like if you just ask everyday people who've not spent a lot of time studying it, they don't have that perspective. And so I often view that to be part of my job of to try to like, not to try to like promote heterodox viewpoints, but just like people don't know the orthodox viewpoint. People don't know how weird it is, the stuff that we actually know about things that we have good reasons for believing. So let's go with yeah, I guess maybe The Man Who Knew Infinity. This is also Knagle. This is about Ramanujan. It was made into a movie, which I have not watched, but it's basically about his life of this Indian boy who was obsessed with math and was kind of really a self-taught genius. Peak by Aaronson. That's the best popular book on his ideas by Robert Poole. I was very lucky to be able to interact with Aaronson briefly before he passed away when I was working on Ultralearning, because he's definitely one of my intellectual, people who inspired a lot of my work.
I got to talk to him on the phone once, and he said,
Wow.
like, we can do an interview when my next book comes out. And I don't know if it was this book or some other book, but then he
Passed away.
he passed away, and so
Yeah,
unfortunately never happened.
that is too bad. Well, there is a book kind of at the bottom that's a little clipped out called Why Don't Students Like School? This is Daniel Willingham. I highly recommend Daniel Willingham's book. This is like, Why Don't Students Like School? I feel like it's a bad title, as the book is basically like cognitive science, how learning works, how education works. But I would say I would put Willingham in kind of this idea of pushing back against some of these notions that, like, I see him as being like slightly antagonistic to some of these sort of maybe more progressive education ideas of like, well, school should be fun, and the fact that students don't like school is this great indictment of the process. And I see him as being somewhat allied with like Kirchner and Hirsch and some of these people, but he's a great cognitive scientist, and he writes. Every once in a while you'll see him do op-eds for newspapers and stuff about some kind of cognitive science piece, and I really like his work. The Reading Mind is also good. That was not on my bookshelf. I think my wife borrowed that book, so it wasn't in the bookshelf when I took the pictures. Where are we here? Is The Sun Also Rises there? I think maybe this is The Sun Also Rises with the Capman. I can't quite see it on the over on the left.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Gregory Clark. So this is the one I was talking about. Great book. I remember this one more than Farewell to Alms. This one is basically like using the rare surname approach to find out that there's actually like quite a bit more stickiness of where you are in the social hierarchy, and that, despite many changes in history, this kind of the same sort of people end up on top and the same sort of people end up in the bottom. So it's a little bit of a bleak book in that way, but I think the methodology is so fascinating that's just worth reading.
And there's the book we were just talking about.
Yeah, right. Everything is Obvious, unless you know the answer. Duncan Watts, great book. He has a real good takedown of Gladwell in this book, where he's like basically arguing against something in the tipping point. But he makes this case that we have this profound hindsight bias when it comes to presenting this kind of social scientific information, is that you tell people it's A or you tell people it's not A, and both of those sound reasonable. So people are like, oh yeah, that's obvious, right? But it's only obvious when you know the answer. And so he talks about how, like, knowing whether it's A or not A, knowing whether plausible sounding story A is right, or a plausible story sounding B, which is different from A, is right. Like, these things are important. Let's see. This book is not going to be for everyone, but since we're 4 hours into it, why not? A Billion Wicked Thoughts is a like sociological analysis of pornography and adult like romance books and stuff, and it's these sex researchers using this data to say like basically what men and women consume in their adult content about human sexuality. So definitely don't read this one at work, but it's fascinating. I won't say more.
And that's a good book by Dennett.
Oh yeah, Inside Jokes. Yeah. I don't know where all my Dennett books are. I have so many. I have Intuition Pumps and Consciousness Explained, and all this review really shows me is that how many books I don't have that I've read that are on here, because I keep thinking of books and I'm like, where's that book? So, I think after my Marie Kondo phase, I'm gonna have to like repurchase some of these at some point. But I'm glad we were able to get through them, and I'm glad that we were able to say something about most of them.
So as we wrap up here, do you have any final thoughts and
To the
and
two people who've listened this far.
and then is there any, do you want to say where people can find you and the
Yeah.
projects you're currently working on?
So you can find me. So all the two people who are still listening can go to scotthyoung.com to my website and my books, Ultralearning, Get Better at Anything. And I have projects, and I write about books. So a lot of these I have reviewed on my blog in some places. Especially, when I was doing my last research book, I would do these research dumps where I would write about some of these things. So you can find essays talking about some of these books in my now voluminous archives. I've got like 1,500 essays in there. So yeah, and hopefully one or two of these books sounds interesting to you.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for sharing your library, and
Thank
we
you.
look forward to seeing everybody in the comments. If you have any questions, suggestions, recommendations, and so we'll see you there. Thanks again, Scott.
Thank you.